Imagine standing at the edge of a canyon so vast, so ancient, that the stones beneath your feet have witnessed civilizations rise and vanish without a trace. No written records, no clear explanation, just silence, and the haunting feeling that something profound happened here, something humanity has never fully grasped. For generations, researchers have studied, debated, and walked away humbled, because some mysteries don't surrender their secrets easily. Ancient knowledge carved into stone, encoded in ceremony, whispered through oral traditions spanning thousands of years. So settle in, because what you're about to discover may permanently change how you see Native America. Somewhere beneath the rolling hills of southern Ohio, buried under centuries of soil and silence, lies one of the most remarkable and least understood civilizations ever to exist on North American soil. They left no written language, no palace walls, no throne rooms or declarations of power. What they left instead were earthworks, massive geometric mounds of sculpted earth so precise, so deliberately arranged that modern surveyors have confirmed their alignments with lunar cycles spanning 18 years. Structures built by human hands, without metal tools, without the wheel, without any of the technological advantages we assume are necessary for such ambition. They were called the Hope Well, and sometime around 400 AD, they simply stopped. From roughly 100 BC to 500 AD, the Hopewell culture flourished across a vast network, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. This was not a single tribe, but rather a web of interconnected communities bound together by trade, ceremony, and a shared artistic vision of extraordinary sophistication. Copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from Yellowstone, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, mica sheets carved into human hands, and bird talons. These materials traveled thousands of miles to reach Hopewell ceremonial sites, evidence of a trade network so expansive it has no parallel in ancient North America. Their burial mounds contain the remains of individuals adorned with objects of breathtaking craftsmanship, effigy pipes, carved with such anatomical precision that ornithologists today can identify the exact bird species depicted. Geometric earthworks aligned to astronomical events with an accuracy that still commands the respect of modern engineers. So this was a civilization of genuine complexity. And then somewhere between 400 and 500 AD, the ceremonies ended. The trade routes went quiet. The mound building ceased. Archaeologists have proposed several explanations, and none of them are entirely satisfying. Climate change is one leading theory, a cooling period that disrupted agriculture and destabilized the food system supporting large ceremonial gatherings. Resource depletion is another. Perhaps the enormous labor required to sustain these massive earthwork projects simply became unsustainable over time. Some researchers point to internal conflict, evidence of increased warfare appearing in the archaeological record around this period. Others suggest that the Hopewell were not so much a collapsed civilization as a transformed one, their populations dispersing and gradually blending into the cultures that followed. But here is what makes the disappearance so quietly unsettling. There are no clear signs of invasion, no sudden catastrophic destruction, no single dramatic event visible in the soil. The Hopewell didn't appear to flee, they didn't appear to burn, they simply faded. Some researchers operating outside mainstream archaeology have pointed to more speculative possibilities. Epidemic disease introduced through far-reaching trade networks, spiritual or cultural collapse, a loss of the belief systems that gave the mound-building tradition its meaning and momentum. A few fringe voices have even suggested deliberate withdrawal, a conscious turning inward by communities choosing isolation over interconnection. None of these theories have been proven. None have been entirely dismissed. What we are left with are the earthworks themselves. Silent, geometric, enduring. Newark earthworks in Ohio, Mound City, Hopewell, Mound Group. Structures that once hummed with ceremony, with smoke, with the movement of thousands of people carrying sacred objects across a continent. Now they hold only grass and wind, and somewhere beneath that stillness, the real story of what happened to the Hopewell waits. Patient, unmarked, and as yet untold. What if the answer isn't buried in what they left behind, but in what they chose to take with them? The Hopewell were not alone in their ambition, what they represented. This impulse to shape the earth itself into something sacred, something permanent, something meant to outlast the people who built it, was part of a far older and far wider tradition, one that stretched back thousands of years before the Hopewell ever placed the first basket of soil onto their ceremonial grounds, one that even today we have only begun to truly understand. Across the eastern half of North America, from the Mississippi River Valley to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf, there are mounds, thousands of them, tens of thousands in fact, many still unexcavated, many destroyed by centuries of farming and development before anyone thought to study them carefully. What remains is staggering enough. What has been lost may be even more significant. These are the works of the mound builders, a term that does not describe a single people, but rather a succession of cultures spanning nearly 5,000 years of continuous tradition. And the questions they leave behind are as layered and complex as the earth they moved. The earliest mounds we know of date back to around 3500 BC. Watson Brake, in northern Louisiana. 11 mounds, connected by a ridged oval, constructed by a hunter-gatherer society, that by all conventional assumptions should not have possessed the organizational capacity to build anything of this scale. There was no agriculture to sustain a large labor force, no obvious centralized authority to coordinate the effort, and yet there it stands, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid at Giza, quietly disproving every assumption we once held about the complexity of early North American life. Then came Poverty Point, around 1700 BC, a site in northeastern Louisiana consisting of 6 concentric semicircular ridges, precisely arranged covering an area of nearly 1 square mile. Researchers estimate that construction required the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth carried by hand, shaped by hand over generations. The people who built it left behind trade goods from across the continent, finely crafted tools, and an architectural sophistication that still draws archaeologists from around the world. And then, centuries later, Cahokia. If any single site captures the full weight of the mound builder mystery, it is Cahokia. Located just outside present-day St. Louis, Missouri, at its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to an estimated 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Larger than London, larger than many European capitals, it contained over 120 urn mounds, arranged across a carefully planned urban landscape dominated by Monk's Mound, a structure covering more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Mainstream archaeology describes Cahokia as the apex of the Mississippian culture, a sophisticated, hierarchical society built on agriculture, long-distance trade, and complex religious ceremony. And that description is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough to explain everything. The astronomical alignments at Cahokia are precise in ways that suggest deep and deliberate knowledge of celestial movements. A series of large wooden posts, now called woodhengi, tracked solar events with remarkable accuracy, functioning as a kind of calendar embedded into the landscape itself. The planning required to execute Cahokia's layout to orient its structures and open plazas in relation to the sun, the moon, and the horizon implies a level of scientific understanding that sits uncomfortably with older narratives about pre-Columbian North America. And then there is the question of what happened to Cahokia. By 1350 AD, the city was largely abandoned. The population had scattered. The mound-building tradition that had defined the region for centuries quietly ended. Researchers point to environmental degradation, prolonged drought, political instability, and the collapse of the trade networks that had sustained the city's growth. These are plausible explanations supported by evidence, but they are not complete explanations, because beyond the mainstream archaeology, there exists a longer and more contested history of interpretation surrounding the mound builders. one that reveals as much about the people doing the interpreting as it does about the mounds themselves. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, European settlers encountering these massive earthworks refused to believe they had been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples living among them. The mounds were too large, too sophisticated, too deliberate, and so theories emerged, some fanciful, some politically motivated, attributing the mounds to lost tribes, to wandering civilizations from across the ocean, to peoples long vanished before the arrival of Native Americans themselves. These theories were wrong. Archaeology has established beyond reasonable doubt that the mounds were built by the soft ancestors of native peoples whose descendants are still here today. The lost race mythology was a colonial construct, used in part to justify displacement, by suggesting that Native Americans had themselves displaced an earlier, more deserving civilization. But dismissing the fringe theories does not dissolve all of the genuine mystery, because some questions remain without clean answers. How did cultures without writing, without metal tools, without wheeled transport, coordinate construction projects of this magnitude across generations? What was the precise nature of the belief system that motivated the movement of millions of tons of earth? Why does the mound-building tradition appear, disappear, and reappear across thousands of years and dozens of distinct cultures, as though something fundamental in the human relationship with this land kept calling people back to the same impulse? The mounds themselves offer no easy answers. They sit in fields and forests and city parks across the American heartland, patient, weathered, largely unnoticed by the people who drive past them every day. But they are still here, and in their silence, they hold something we haven't fully named yet. A memory, perhaps. A record, written not in words, but in earth and geometry, and the slow accumulation of human intention. The question is not only who built them, the question is what they were trying to say, and whether after all this time, we are finally ready to listen. And yet, the mounds were not the only thing left behind. Across the vast interior of North America, in places that history has largely forgotten, there are other silences, other absences, places where thousands of people once lived, breathed, traded, and built. And then, with a quiet that defies easy explanation, were simply gone, not conquered in a single decisive moment, not buried beneath volcanic ash or swallowed by rising water, just absent, leaving behind only the faint impression of a life that was once, by any measure, extraordinary. One of those places is a wide, wind-swept stretch of land in what is now southern Kansas, where the Arkansas and Walnut Rivers meet in a gentle confluence of muddy water and tall grass. To drive through it today is to see nothing remarkable. Flat horizon, open sky, the occasional farmhouse breaking the line where earth meets air. It is by all appearances empty country. But beneath that stillness, and threaded through the historical record in fragments and whispers, lies the memory of something enormous. This is Etzanoa, and its story is only now beginning to be told. The name comes from Spanish accounts, specifically from the journals of Juan Donate, the Spanish conquistador who dispatched a small scouting party into the southern plains in 6001. What his soldiers reported finding was by any standard astonishing: a city, not a village, not a seasonal camp, but a sprawling permanent settlement stretching for miles along the riverbanks. They estimated the population at 20,000 people. Some accounts suggest even more. The settlement was home to the Wicha people, semi-sedentary agriculturalists who had built their distinctive grass lodges across the landscape in numbers that stunned the Spanish soldiers who walked among them. For centuries, historians treated these accounts with skepticism. The numbers seemed inflated, the location was vague, and the absence of any obvious physical remains made it easy to dismiss as exaggeration, the kind of grandiose reporting that Spanish explorers were known to produce when justifying their expeditions to distant crowns. Then, in 2015, an archaeologist named Donald Blakesley began to look more carefully, working with historical documents, soil surveys, and a surprisingly useful collaboration with a local high school student who began finding artifacts in the fields near Arkansas City, Kansas. Blakesley started piecing together a picture that aligned with the Spanish accounts in ways too precise to be coincidental. Thousands of artifacts emerged from the soil, arrow points, pottery fragments, the remnants of a population that had lived here in genuine density. The geography matched, the timeline matched, and slowly, reluctantly, the academic community began to acknowledge what the Spanish had written down more than 400 years ago. Etzinoa was real, but that confirmation only sharpened the central question. Because sometime in the early to mid-600s, within decades of that Spanish encounter, Etzinoa was abandoned. A city of 20,000 people, one of the largest pre-Columbian settlements on the Great Plains, emptied out and faded from the landscape so completely that its very existence was debated for centuries. Mainstream explanations point first and most urgently to disease. The arrival of European explorers, even in brief and limited contact, introduced pathogens to which indigenous populations had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses could travel far ahead of European settlement itself, moving through trade networks and entertaining speed. A city as large and densely populated as Etzinoa would have been catastrophically vulnerable. Epidemics of this kind have been documented across the continent, capable of reducing populations by 50, 60, even 90% within a generation. There is also the factor of intensifying conflict. The arrival of European trade goods and critically European horses was rapidly reshaping the balance of power across the plains. New mounted raiding cultures were emerging. Old territorial arrangements were breaking down. A large, semi-edentary settlement, like rich in stored agriculture and established infrastructure, may have become a target in ways it had never been before. These explanations carry weight. They are grounded in patterns repeated across the continent during the same period, but they don't account for everything, because some researchers have noted that the abandonment of Etzinoa appears to have been remarkably orderly. There is little archaeological evidence of mass casualties at the site itself. No mass graves, no signs of the kind of catastrophic violence that would leave a clear signature in the soil. If disease or warfare drove the population away, they appear to have left deliberately, taking what they could carry, dispersing into the broader landscape, rather than dying where they stood, which raises a quieter and more unsettling possibility. What if they chose to leave? Some historians and anthropologists have speculated that the Wicha people of Etzinoa made a calculated decision, reading the horizon of European expansion and deliberately fragmenting their population, scattering into smaller, less visible groups that would be harder to find, harder to subjugate, harder to destroy. It would have been, in its own way, a form of strategic survival, a civilization choosing invisibility over vulnerability. There is no direct evidence for this theory, but there is also nothing that definitively rules it out. What we are left with is the land itself, ordinary-looking, quietly agricultural, cut through by two rivers that have been flowing in the same direction for 10,000 years. Somewhere beneath the fields outside Arkansas City, Kansas, the remnants of a great city wait in the soil. Most of it has never been excavated. Most of its story has never been told. 20,000 people lived here. They built homes, raised children, stored grain, conducted ceremony, and looked out over the same rivers that still run there today. And then they were gone, not erased, not forgotten by their own descendants, but rendered invisible to the historical record in a way that took 4 centuries to even partially correct. What else are we still getting wrong? And who else have we failed to see? Visibility is a strange thing. Some mysteries hide in plain sight, not buried beneath the earth, not locked away in forgotten archives, but sitting in the open air, touched by weather and tide, and the hands of countless curious visitors, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Etzinoa was invisible because no one was looking. What comes next has been looked at for centuries, studied, debated, copied, and argued over by some of the finest minds of every era. And still, no one can agree on what it means. At the edge of the Taunton River in southeastern Massachusetts, there sits a large, flat-faced boulder of gray-brown crystalline sandstone. It weighs approximately 40 tons. Its face is covered completely in deeply carved symbols, figures, and markings that stretch across nearly 11 feet of surface. Some resemble human figures, some appear to be geometric patterns, others look, depending on who is doing the looking, like animals, like maps, like letters from a dozen different alphabets, or like nothing recognizable at all. This is Dion rock, and it has been confounding researchers since at least 1680, when the Reverend John Danforth made the first recorded copy of its inscriptions. In the 3.5 centuries since, it has generated more competing theories per square foot than perhaps any other object in North American archaeology. The rock itself is ancient in a way that is difficult to precisely define because the carvings resist easy dating. Petroglyphs, carved into stone, do not decay the way organic material does. They cannot be carbon dated. What we know is that the markings were there before European settlement, observed and acknowledged by indigenous peoples of the region long before any colonial scholar arrived to record them. The Wanoag people, whose ancestral territory surrounds the site, have their own relationship with this rock, one that predates every academic theory by generations. The most widely accepted explanation among mainstream archaeologists today is that the carvings are the work of the Wampawage, or other Algonquin-speaking peoples of the Northeast. Petroglyphs of similar style and iconography have been found throughout the region, and the imagery on Dion rock, figures, animals, abstract marks, fits patterns found in indigenous rock art across North America. This interpretation is grounded, reasonable, and supported by the cultural context of the landscape itself. But Dion rock has never been content to rest quietly within a single explanation. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister and scholar, examined it in 1690 and concluded the markings were Phoenician. In the 18th century, Count Antoine Quay de Jabelin, a French scholar with wide-ranging and frequently imaginative theories, suggested a connection to ancient Carthage. Later, a Harvard professor named Ezra Stiles became convinced the rock bore Phoenician script, left by seafarers who had crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. Each new generation of scholars arrived with a new theory, and each new theory said as much about that era's fascinations and anxieties as it did about the rock itself. Then came the Norse hypothesis. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as interest in Viking exploration of North America grew, eventually validated by the discovery of the Norse settlement at Lono Meadows in Newfoundland, some researchers began reading Dion rock's Piur's markings as runic inscriptions left by Leif Erikson or his contemporaries. The shapes of certain symbols seemed to those who wanted to see it consistent with early Norse public. Enthusiasts mapped out translations. Academics pushed back. The debate sharpened and then gradually faded without resolution. Perhaps the most persistent and passionately argued alternative theory connects Dion rock to Miguel Corte Royal, a Portuguese explorer who disappeared during a voyage to North America in 1502. His supporters point to what they interpret as a Portuguese coat of arms among the carvings, along with a date and the explorer's name hidden within the markings. Portugal took the theory seriously enough that a replica of the rock was displayed at a world exposition in the 20th century. Some Brazilian and Portuguese scholars still argue the case today. And then there are the interpretations that exist further still from the academic mainstream. Readings that see in Dion rock evidence of ancient Chinese navigation, of pre-Columbian contact with Mediterranean civilizations, of a record so layered and so deliberately encoded that its true meaning was meant only for those who already knew what to look for. None of these theories have been proven. Several have been convincingly challenged, and yet none of them have been silenced entirely because the rock itself refuses to yield a definitive answer. Part of what makes Titan rock so enduringly mysterious is the nature of the carvings themselves. They do not read cleanly in any single direction. They overlap. They appear to belong to different hands, possibly different periods. Some lines are deeply incised, others are shallow and faint. It is possible, even likely, that what we are looking at is not a single message left by a single hand, but an accumulation, a surface returned to again and again, over centuries, by different people, for different reasons, each adding their own mark to something they found already present and already significant. If that is true, then Dian Rock is not a mystery with a single solution. It is a palimpsest, a layered record of human presence, human curiosity, and human need to mark the world and say, I was here, we were here, this place matters. The rock now sits inside a small museum in Berkeley, Massachusetts, lifted from the riverbed and preserved behind glass, safe from the tides that once washed over it twice a day for centuries. But the markings remain exactly as unresolved as they ever were. 40 tons of stone covered in symbols that have outlasted every civilization that has tried to claim them. What if the reason no single theory fits is because more than one of them is true, and the rock has simply been waiting for us to become comfortable enough with complexity to accept that? Dian Rock confronted us with the limits of interpretation, with how much we can project onto a surface, and how little we can know for certain about what another human mind intended to communicate across a distance of centuries. But what happens when the message is not carved into stone, but written across the land itself? What happens when the text is so large that you cannot read it from the ground, when you have to rise above it, pull back far enough to see the whole shape before the meaning begins to emerge? That is the experience of Newark earthworks, and it is one that changes people. In the rolling terrain of Licking County, Ohio, in what is now the city of Newark, there exists the largest set of geometric earthen enclosures ever built anywhere on the surface of the earth. Not in Egypt, not in China, not in the ancient Near East. Here in the American Midwest, a culture we know as the Hopewell, the same people whose disappearance opened this journey, constructed a complex of squares, circles, and octagons so vast and so precisely executed that its full dimensions were not properly understood until aerial photography became available in the 20th century. At its original extent, the Newark earthworks covered more than 4 square miles. 4 square miles of deliberately shaped earth, moved and sculpted entirely by human hands, without metal tools, without surveying equipment, as we understand it, without any written, mathematical tradition that we have yet identified. The walls of the enclosure stood between 5 and 14 feet high. The main circular enclosure, known today as the Great Circle, measures nearly 1,200 feet in diameter, with walls enclosing an interior area large enough to contain 4 Roman colosseums. These are not estimates. These are measurements. Mainstream archaeology situates the Newark earthworks firmly within the Hopewell tradition, dating their construction to between 100 BC and 500 A. The site functioned as a major ceremonial center, a place of gathering, ritual, and perhaps pilgrimage, drawing people from across the vast Hopewell trade network. The geometric forms themselves, circles, squares, and the distinctive octagon, appear repeatedly across Hopewell sites throughout Ohio, suggesting a shared cosmological vocabulary, a set of sacred shapes that carried meaning across communities and generations. That much is established. What is less established, and what has quietly electrified the research community over the past several decades, is the relationship between these earthworks and the sky. In the 1980s, astronomers Ray Hively and Robert Horn began a systematic analysis of the Newark complex, measuring the alignments of its walls, gateways, and geometric axis against known astronomical events. What they found was not coincidental. The octagon earthworks, the most geometrically complex section of the site, align with extraordinary precision to the movements of the moon, specifically to the lunar standstill cycle, an 18-year pattern in which the moon's rising and, setting points slowly shift to their most extreme northern and southern positions before reversing direction. The 8 gateway openings of the octagon correspond to the 8 distinct moonrise and moonset positions defined by this cycle. The alignments are accurate to within a fraction of a degree. To achieve this level of precision without modern instruments would have required generations of careful, systematic observation, a tradition of watching the sky and recording what was seen passed down through time with extraordinary fidelity. Hively and Horn were careful in their conclusions. They did not claim to know why the Hope well encoded the lunar standstill into their earthworks, or what ceremonies took place there during the moments of alignment. But the precision itself is beyond reasonable dispute. These people knew the sky in ways we are only beginning to appreciate, and that knowledge raises questions that the archaeological record alone cannot answer. How was this geometric and astronomical information transmitted across generations without writing? How are the earthworks designed? How were perfect circles and precise octagons laid out across miles of uneven terrain, using only the tools and materials available 2,000 years ago? Some researchers have proposed sophisticated rope and post-survey techniques. Others have suggested that the shapes themselves encode mathematical relationships, that the ratio between the circle and octagon at Newark reflects a deep understanding of geometric principles that would not appear in European mathematics for another 1,000 years. Outside mainstream scholarship, the implications have drawn wider speculation. Some researchers have noted that the square root of 2, an irrational number central to the geometry of the octagon, appears encoded in the proportional relationships between different sections of the Newark complex. Whether this was intentional or emergent, whether it reflects formal mathematical knowledge or an intuitive geometric tradition, remains genuinely unresolved. There are also those who argue that the Newark earthworks were not merely ceremonial, but functional, that they served as a kind of calendar, an observatory, a permanent instrument for tracking time and sky in service of agricultural, spiritual, or political needs we can barely imagine from this distance. Today, the Newark earthworks survive only in fragments. The city of Newark grew up around and through them during the 19th century. Roads were cut through the walls. Neighborhoods were built inside the enclosures. A golf course, still operating today, occupies the interior of the octagon. What remains is remarkable. What was lost is incalculable. The great circle survives. The octagon survives. And on certain nights, when the moon rises to its extreme northern position and its light falls through the gateway openings exactly as it must have fallen 2,000 years ago, something in the geometry of the place reasserts itself. The shape still works. The alignment still holds. Whatever the Hope well were tracking, they built it to last. Which returns us always to the same quiet question. We know what they built. We know with growing confidence what they were watching. But what did it mean to them? And is it possible that in all our study, all our measurement, all our careful analysis, we are still only standing at the outermost wall, looking in? There is something humbling about standing at the outermost wall of another civilization's, understanding and realizing the wall goes deeper than you thought. At Newark, we measured alignments and marveled at geometry. We traced the movements of the moon across centuries of careful human observation and asked what it meant to the people who encoded it into the earth. But those people, the Hopewell, with their trade networks and their ceremonial complexity, were themselves the inheritors of something older, something so much older that it reframes the entire timeline of human presence in North America in ways that archaeology is still carefully and sometimes reluctantly coming to terms with to find that older story. We leave Ohio's river valleys and travel west past the Great Plains, past the Rocky Mountains, into the high desert of south-central Oregon, a landscape that feels even today like the edge of the world. Volcanic rock formations rise from the basin floor in strange eroded shapes. The air is dry and thin, and carries the silence of deep geological time. There are no cities here, very few roads, just sage and rero, and the memory of an ancient lake that once covered this entire valley floor thousands of years ago, when the climate of North America was something unrecognizable to us today. In the wall of a volcanic tuff ring, a crater-like formation, created by ancient eruptions, there is a cave. It is not dramatic from the outside. A shallow overhang, maybe 50 feet wide, cut into the pale rock face above what was once a shoreline. Unremarkable until you know what was found inside. This is Fort Rock Cave, and what Luther Cressman discovered here in 1938 quietly rewrote the story of the Americas. Cressman was an Oregon archaeologist, sometimes called the father of Oregon archaeology, and what he found, buried beneath the cave's dry sediment floor, were sandals, dozens of them, woven from sagebrush bark, with a technique of remarkable sophistication, twisted and plaited into a form that fit the human foot with deliberate care. Some were plain, others showed decorative patterning. All of them were clearly the product of a tradition, not an experiment, not a first attempt, but a refined craft that had been practiced and refined over time. When radiocarbon dating became available, the sandals were tested. The results were startling. The oldest specimens dated to approximately 10,000 BC, making them among the oldest human artifacts ever found in North America. Some subsequent analyses have suggested dates potentially older still, pushing toward 13,000 years ago, though these figures remain subjects of ongoing scholarly discussion. 10,000 years before the Common Era, at a time when the glaciers of the last ice age were only beginning their long retreat, when the landscape of Oregon looked nothing like it does today, when Fort Rock Valley was a lake and the cave entrance sat near the waterline, and the people who left their sandals behind existed in a world so different from our own that imagining it requires a genuine effort of the mind. Mainstream archaeology accepts Fort Rock Cave as evidence of the Paleo-Indian occupation, the Great Basin, part of the broader picture of early human migration into and across the North-Pressed American continent, following the retreat of the ice sheets. The sandals themselves are interpreted as functional objects, evidence of a mobile hunter, gatherer people making sophisticated use of available plant materials in a challenging environment. The craftsmanship is noted, the age is documented, the site is acknowledged as significant, and it is significant, profoundly so, but the sandals themselves carry questions that the mainstream framework, while answering some things, leaves quietly open. The weaving technique used in the Fort Rock sandals is not simple. It is not the kind of construction you arrive at quickly or accidentally. The specific twisting pattern used to create the sole, the way the toe and heel are formed, the decorative elements present on some examples, these reflect a tradition with history behind it, a tradition that had to have developed somewhere over some period of time before the people who made these sandals ever set foot in this cave, which means the story begins earlier than the sandals. It always does. Some researchers operating at the edges of the conventional timeline have used Fort Rock Cave as one piece of a larger argument that human presence in the Americas predates the traditionally accepted arrival window, that the peopling of the continent was more complex, more varied, and more ancient than the models built in the mid-9th century could accommodate. The debate over pre-Clovis populations in the Americas has intensified significantly in recent decades, with sites across North and South America producing dates and artifacts that challenge the standard narrative. Fort Rock Cave does not resolve that debate, but it sits within it quietly as a reminder that the further back we look, the more we find, and the more what we find disrupts what we thought we knew. There is also something in the human scale of the sandals that resists purely academic analysis. These were not monuments. They were not ceremonial objects or astronomical instruments or geometric earthworks. They were shoes. Someone made them to wear. Someone, or many someones, over many generations, sat in this cave, or near this lakeshore, working sagebrush fiber through their fingers, shaping something practical and necessary, and in its own quiet way, beautiful. That person had a life, had people they knew, places they traveled, knowledge they carried and passed on. They existed in full as completely as any human being who has ever lived, and we know almost nothing about them except that they were here in this cave, beside this ancient lake, 10,000 years before anyone thought to write any of it down. How many other caves hold evidence we haven't found yet? How many other stories are waiting in the sediment, in the dry silence of places we haven't thought to look? The sandals survived, fragile as they were. They lasted, which means the people who made them were in some sense still speaking. Are we listening carefully enough to hear them? The sandals at Fort Rock Cave were a private thing, made for one person, worn by one body, moving through one life, in one particular corner of an ancient world. They survived by accident, preserved by the same dry volcanic silence that preserved so much else in that high desert cave. And in their survival, they gave us something rare and irreplaceable, a moment of genuine human intimacy across 10,000 years. But not every message from the ancient world was meant to be private. Some were meant to be seen. Some were placed deliberately in the open, on exposed rock faces, in locations that invited approach, as if the people who made them understood that what they were recording needed to outlast not just one life, but many. Not just one generation, but all of them. Drive south through Minnesota, away from the cities and into the wide, quietly dramatic landscape of the southwestern prairie, and you will eventually come to a long, low outcropping of red Sioux quartzite, rising from the grassland like the spine of something ancient, breaking the surface. The rock is the color of dried blood in certain light. In morning sun, it glows almost amber. It has been here in essentially this form for more than 1 billion years, older than complex life on this planet, older than anything that might be called a witness to human history. And yet humans chose it, returned to it, marked it again and again across a span of time so vast it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. This is the Jeffers Petroglyph site, and spread across this exposed quartzite surface are more than 2,000 individual carvings, images of humans, animals, weapons, and symbols that span at least 7,000 years of continuous human presence on this prairie. 7,000 years. To put that in perspective, the oldest carvings here were made before the Egyptian pyramids were conceived, before writing existed anywhere on Earth, before the Bronze Age had begun in the ancient Near East. The most recent were made within the last few centuries by the Dakota and other peoples for whom this site remained actively sacred into the era of European contact and beyond. Mainstream archaeology and indigenous scholarship are at this site more than most in genuine conversation. The Dakota people have oral traditions connected to this landscape. The site is not merely a historical curiosity for them, it is a living place, one that carries spiritual significance that has never been interrupted, even as the world around it changed beyond recognition. Researchers working here have increasingly sought to integrate indigenous knowledge into the interpretation of the carvings, recognizing that the people whose ancestors made them may carry understanding that no amount of external analysis can replicate. What the carvings show is in itself extraordinary at Ral's. The spear-throwing devices that preceded the bow and arrow appear in the older layers, helping to date those sections of the rock. Figures that appear to be in ceremonial postures. Animals that no longer exist in Minnesota, including representations that some researchers interpret as species that vanished from this region thousands of years ago. Thunderbirds, the powerful spiritual beings that appear across the iconography of dozens of distinct native cultures across the continent, rendered here with a consistency of form that speaks to a shared and deeply held belief system. And then, there are the figures that resist easy categorization. Some of the human-like forms at Jeffers are depicted in positions that scholars have associated with shamanic practice. The altered states of consciousness used by spiritual practitioners across cultures, worldwide, to access knowledge, healing, and communication with non-ordinary reality. Figures with radiating lines suggesting power or energy. Beings that appear to be transforming between human and animal forms. Images that may represent visions, journeys, or encounters with forces that the people who carve them experienced as utterly real. Neuropsychological research conducted since the 1980s has proposed that certain recurring patterns in rock art worldwide, geometric forms, and toptic phenomena, transformation figures, may be connected to the universal architecture of human consciousness during altered states. Under this framework, some of what we see at Jeffers may be less a narrative record of external events and more a map of interior experience, a documentation of what was seen, felt, and encountered in states of consciousness that most modern Western frameworks have no category for. This interpretation neither diminishes the carvings nor reduces them to mere hallucination. It suggests instead that the people who made them were engaged in something systematic and intentional, a practice of accessing and recording dimensions of experience that they considered as real and as worth preserving as anything in the physical world. Outside even this framework, there are questions that linger. Why this rock? Of all the exposed quartzite surfaces in this landscape, why did generation after generation return to this specific location across 7 millennia? Was there something about the site itself, its position in the landscape, its acoustic properties, its relationship to water sources or celestial alignments that drew people back? Or was it simply the accumulated weight of the carvings already there, each generation adding to what the previous one had left? The rock becoming more sacred with each mark precisely because it already held so many. The wind moves across the quartzite surface the same way it has always moved. The rock absorbs the heat of the day and releases it slowly into the evening air. In certain conditions, standing quietly on this surface, you can hear the grass moving in the distance, a sound that has accompanied every person who ever stood in this place and looked down at the dem. Marks left by those who came before. 2,000 carvings, 7,000 years, dozens of cultures, one rock. What is it that keeps calling people back to the same place, across so much time and so much change, with the same impulse to mark the surface, to leave something behind, to say in whatever language is available? This matters, and I was here to witness it. And what did they witness here that made them certain it was worth remembering forever? There is something about the act of returning. At Jeffers, we saw it written across 7,000 years of accumulated marks, generation after generation, drawn back to the same red quartzite surface, adding their voices to a conversation that had begun before memory could reach it. The impulse to return, to add, to witness what others had witnessed before you. It is one of the most deeply human things we know, and it raises a question that follows us as we move through these landscapes. What happens when the returning stops? When the accumulation ends and the site is left to silence and wind and the slow patience of stone? Sometimes what remains is more than a mystery. Sometimes it is a controversy. Travel southeast from the Minnesota prairie, past the flat agricultural heart of the continent, and continue into the high plains of southeastern Colorado, a landscape that operates on a different scale than most of the country. The sky here is enormous. The land stretches in every direction with a flatness that is almost disorienting, broken only by the occasional draw or canyon cutting down through the sedimentary layers where ancient water once ran. It is a spare, demanding landscape, one that does not offer comfort easily, but rewards patience with a particular kind of stark, unadorned beauty. In Baca County, Colorado, one of those canyons cuts through the prairie in a series of sandstone, walls and sheltered alcoves that have provided shade, water, and protection from the wind for as long as humans have moved through this part of the world. The canyon is called Picture Canyon, named for what covers its walls. Petroglyphs and pictographs line the sandstone surfaces throughout the canyon system. Animal figures, human forms, abstract symbols, and geometric markings. In this respect, Picture Canyon shares common ground with Jeffers, with Dighton Rock, with dozens of other sites we might have explored along this journey. Indigenous rock art in this region is documented and studied, and within its proper cultural tour. Context broadly understood as the work of the ancestral peoples of the southern plains, the Comanche, the Apache, and cultures reaching back much further into the Archaic period. That consensus is real, and it is grounded in genuine scholarship. But Picture Canyon carries an additional layer of controversy that has never been fully resolved, one that begins not with indigenous imagery, but with a very different kind of marking, found among the canyon walls' inscriptions that a growing number of researchers operating largely outside the mainstream archaeological establishment have identified as Ogham scriptum, is an early medieval writing system associated with the Celtic peoples of Ireland and Britain. Dating primarily from the 4th to 7th centuries AD, consists of a series of horizontal or diagonal strokes cut across a central stem line, a simple but distinctive system used primarily for marking names and boundaries on standing stones throughout the British Isles. It is recognizable to those who know it with a certain clarity, and the claim made most prominently by researchers like Barry Fell in his controversial 1976 book America J.C., is that markings found at Picture Canyon and at a small number of other sites across the American West bear a meaningful resemblance to Ogham script. Fell went further, arguing that these markings represented evidence of pre-Columbian Celtic exploration of North America, and that certain canyon formations at sites like Picture Canyon were deliberately oriented to function as solar calendars. Specifically, that at the winter solstice, light enters the canyon and illuminates particular markings in a way that could only be intentional. The mainstream archaeological response to Fell work was, and largely remains, sharply critical. His translations were challenged as speculative. His methodology was questioned. The academic consensus holds that the markings identified as Ogham at Picture Canyon and similar sites are either natural erosion features, coincidental groove patterns in the rock, or misidentified indigenous markings viewed through the distorting lens of a predetermined conclusion. These are serious objections. They deserve to be taken seriously. And yet, the solstice light phenomenon at Picture Canyon has proven more difficult to dismiss entirely. Independent observers visiting the site at the winter solstice have documented the way light moves through the canyon and strikes specific wall surfaces in ways that do appear deliberate, that feel to those present like more than coincidence. Whether this reflects intentional design by any particular culture, or whether it reflects indigenous astronomical knowledge encoded into site selection that Fell's framework simply misidentified, remains a genuinely open question. What is certain is that Picture Canyon was used. The indigenous rock art throughout the canyon is real, documented, and significant on its own terms, entirely independent of the Ogham controversy. People sheltered here. People marked these walls across long stretches of time. The canyon itself, with its water source, and protected aloves, and dramatic light conditions, would have been a meaningful place to many different cultures moving through this landscape over many centuries. The Ogham question is in some ways a distraction from that deeper truth, and in other ways, it is an invitation to sit with the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, to resist the pull of both credulous acceptance and reflexive dismissal, and to ask what it would mean if even a fraction of the fringe interpretation turned out to be correct. What would it mean for the story of human movement across this planet? What would it require us to revise about contact, about exploration, about the boundaries we draw between the old world and the new? The canyon does not answer these questions. It holds them the way stone holds heat, absorbing what falls on it, releasing it slowly, long after the source has moved on. The light still enters the canyon at the solstice. The markings are still there on the wall, and the question of who made them, and what they meant, and whether the two kinds of markings in this canyon share any connection at all. That question is still, despite everything, waiting for an answer solid enough to stand on. Picture Canyon left us with a question about authorship, about who leaves a mark, and why, and what it means when the origin of that mark cannot be agreed upon across centuries of looking. But there is another kind of mystery that has nothing to do with contested interpretations, or fringe theories, or the ambiguity of eroded stone. Sometimes the mystery is not about what we cannot read. Sometimes it is about what we can read perfectly, completely, in extraordinary detail, and what that clarity reveals about a world we had no idea existed in such fullness, such richness, such quiet, and devastating completeness. Turn northwest now, leave the high plains of Colorado, and travel toward the Pacific coast, past the Cascades, through the dense temperate rainforest of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, until the land runs out entirely at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. This is one of the most remote stretches of coastline in the contiguous United States. The forest here is ancient and dense, pressing right to the edge of the sea bluffs. The ocean is cold and gray and unforgiving. The wind comes in off the water with a weight to it, carrying salt and the smell of something older than human memory. Here, on a narrow strip of land between the forest and the sea, the Makaka people lived for at least 2,000 years in a village called Ozette. They were whalers, deep-sea hunters who paddled cedar canoes far out into the open Pacific to pursue humpback and gray whales, a practice requiring courage, skill, and a technological sophistication that challenges every assumption about the limits of pre-industrial maritime culture. The Macau harpooned whales from hand-carved boats in open ocean conditions that would test modern vessels. They did it generation after generation, building a way of life so finely adapted to this particular edge of the world that it persisted largely unchanged in its essential character for 2 millennia. And then sometime around 1700 AD, a massive mudslide came down from the hillside above the village. It happened quickly enough that people fled without taking much with them. The mud buried the long houses where they stood, sealing everything inside under meters of wet, oxygen-poor sediment. Tools, baskets, sleeping mats, clothing, carved wooden boxes, harpoon equipment, the entire material contents of several large family longhouses preserved in the kind of anaerobic cold that prevents the decay that would otherwise erase organic material within decades. It stayed buried for more than 250 years. In 1970, winter storms began eroding the bluff at Ozette, and artifacts started washing out of the mudslide deposit onto the beach. The Maka Tribal Council contacted Washington State University, and what followed was one of the most significant and most carefully conducted archaeological excavations in North American history. An 11-year project that recovered more than 55,000 artifacts from the buried village, carried out in close partnership with the Makaka people themselves. What those artifacts revealed was breathtaking in its specificity. This was not the abstract inferential archaeology of most ancient sites, the kind where you find a scatter of stone tools and a few post holes and extrapolate an entire way of life from almost nothing. At Ozette, you could see the life, elaborately woven baskets so finely constructed that their geometric patterns remained vivid after centuries in the mud. Carved wooden combs, carved wooden boxes with dovetail joints of cabinet-maker precision, a wooden spindle whorl decorated with a design of such artistic refinement that it would be remarkable in any cultural tradition in the world. Whale hunting equipment, harpoon shafts, floats, lines that told a detailed story of a sophisticated maritime technology developed entirely independently of any old world tradition, and woven through all of it, a continuity that most archaeological sites can only hint at. Because the Maka people were there for the excavation, their elders recognized objects identified their function, their cultural significance, their place in a living tradition that the mudslide had interrupted but not erased. The gap between the archaeological past and the living present collapsed at Ozette in a way that is genuinely rare in this kind of work. That continuity is in its own way one of the most striking things about the site. But Ozette also carries questions that the excavation raised without fully answering. The village that was buried was not a small seasonal camp. It was a permanent substantial settlement with long houses large enough to shelter multiple family groups, structures that required enormous investment of labor and resource to build and maintain. And Ozette was only one of several Macau village sites along this coastline. The picture that emerges is of a maritime culture of considerable scale and complexity, operating largely below the horizon of historical documentation until the mudslide and its accidental preservation gave us this single extraordinary window. How much of the Pacific Northwest coastal culture, its full complexity, its range of artistic and technological achievement, its social organization, remains invisible to us simply because the materials it was built from do not survive in ordinary conditions. Wood rots, basketry disintegrates, woven fabric disappears within decades in most environments. The Pacific Northwest built its civilization from exactly these materials, and without an accident of preservation like Ozette, almost none of it would have survived. Which means that everywhere along this coast, in every location where a village once stood, and no mudslide happened to bury it at precisely the right moment, the record is simply gone. Not incomplete. Gone. Ozette survived by accident, by the specific geology of one hillside, and the specific timing of one storm, and the specific chemistry of one particular deposit of wet clay. Everything else the ocean took, and so we are left to wonder if one accidental burial gave us 55,000 artifacts and a complete recalibration of what Pacific Northwest culture looked like. What would we find if we could see the rest? What civilizations are we still, without knowing it, failing to see? Ozette humbled us with what preservation can reveal, with how much fullness and complexity can Tremus survive when the right accident of geology intervenes at the right moment. It reminded us that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, that civilizations we have barely imagined may have existed in extraordinary detail, leaving almost no trace simply because the materials they used were never meant to outlast the people who made them. But what happens when the materials do survive, when the structures are made of stone, heavy, permanent, resistant to everything the centuries can throw at them, and yet the mystery only deepens? What happens when the evidence is indisputably there, and the argument is not about whether something was built, but about who built it, and when, and why? That is the particular and deeply contested puzzle waiting in the quiet hills of southern New Orleans. Drive into the woods outside the town of Salem, not Salem, Massachusetts, but its quieter neighbor to the north, and follow a path through second-growth forest until the trees open onto a hillside, scattered with something unexpected. Stone chambers, stone walls, stone tunnels, barely large enough to crawl through. A large flat stone slab, with a groove cut around its perimeter, resting on 4 upright supports positioned above what appears to be a speaking tube that runs underground to a separate chamber nearby. Arranged across the hillside at various distances and orientations, standing upright stones that align with measurable documented precision to the rising and setting points of the sun, at the solstices and equinoxes, and to certain significant lunar positions. This is Mystery Hill, also known more ambitiously as America's Stonehenge. The site covers approximately 30 acres. It contains more than a dozen stone structures of varying size and complexity, connected by low walls and pathways across the wooded hillside. The construction technique, large unmortared stones fitted together with considerable skill, is unlike the documented building traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Northeast, who did not generally construct permanent stone architecture of this kind. It is also in certain structural details reminiscent of megalithic construction traditions found in Western Europe, a resemblance that has driven decades of passionate and frequently acrimonious debate. The mainstream archaeological position on Mystery Hill is cautious and, to many visitors, somewhat unsatisfying. The most widely accepted explanation holds that the structures were built, modified, and added to by European colonial settlers during the 18th and 19th centuries. Farmers who used stone construction for root cellars, storage chambers, and agricultural infrastructure. This was common practice in colonial New England, and stone chambers of broadly similar construction can be found throughout the region, most with reasonably documented histories of colonial construction. The problem is that Mystery Hill's history resists this explanation more stubbornly than most. The site came to wider attention in 1936, when a man named William Goodwin purchased the property and became convinced it was the remains of a settlement built by Irish monks, the Kieldes, who he believed had crossed the Atlantic in the early medieval period. Goodwin's theories were not well received by archaeologists, and his habit of rearranging stones on the site to fit his hypothesis caused damage to the archaeological record that complicates all subsequent analysis. But radiocarbon dating, conducted in the decades after Goodwin on charcoal found in sealed contexts beneath and within the structures, has produced dates that challenge the simple colonial explanation. Some samples have returned dates in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Others have been dated even earlier. The dating evidence is disputed, and questions about sample contamination and context integrity have been raised by skeptical researchers, but it has not been cleanly dismissed. The astronomical alignments add another layer of difficulty to the colonial explanation. The standing stones arranged across the property align to solar and lunar events with a consistency and precision that would be remarkable if accidental, and that seems purposeful, if intentional. Farmers building root cellars do not typically orient their drainage stones to the winter solstice sunrise. The alignment suggests that whoever arranged these stones was paying attention to the sky in a sustained and deliberate way. Outside the mainstream, the theories range widely. Some researchers have argued for pre-Columbian Celtic or Phoenician construction, drawing connections to megalithic traditions in Western Europe and North Africa. Barry Fell, whose work we encountered at Picture Canyon, included Mystery Hill in his broader argument for ancient transatlantic contact, identifying what he claimed were Agam and Phoenician inscriptions on some of the site stones. These claims have been largely rejected by professional archaeologists who point to the lack of corroborating material culture and the interpretive leaps required to sustain them. Others have proposed that the site is the work of indigenous peoples of the Northeast, whose stone-building traditions are simply less well documented than their other material culture. That the assumption of non-indigenous origin is itself a form of the same bias that dismissed Etzinoa, that doubted Cahokia, that looked at the mounds of the Hopewell and invented a lost race to explain them. This possibility deserves more serious consideration than it is generally received. What is certain is that Mystery Hill is genuinely strange. The large, flat stone with its drainage groove, sometimes called the sacrifice table, a name that is more dramatic than evidenced, the speaking tube, the astronomical alignments, the underground chambers, the sheer density of stone construction across a wooded New Hampshire hillside. None of it resolves neatly into a single comfortable explanation. The forest has grown back around it. The stones are lichened and settled and patient. Whatever was happening here, whoever was building here and watching the sky from here, and speaking through that underground tube to whatever was listening in the chamber below, it was happening with intention and with knowledge and with a sense of permanence. Someone built this to last. The question that the stones themselves keep returning to, in their silent, immovable way, is simply this: who looks at a wooded New Hampshire hillside and decides to build something meant to track the movements of the sun and moon for centuries? And why has that person remained, despite everything we have thrown at the question, so completely invisible to us? Mystery Hill left us with stone, unmovable, patient, oriented to a sky that has not changed even as everything beneath it has. It left us with the particular frustration of a mystery that resists resolution, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence refuses to point cleanly in a single direction. And now, as we move deeper into this exploration, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden hand guiding history toward some dramatic revelation, but something quieter and more profound than that. A recognition that across this continent, in landscapes as different from one another as the New Hampshire forest is from the Colorado Canyon or the Oregon desert, human beings have been drawn to certain surfaces, certain formations, certain places where rock meets light in a particular way, and have felt compelled to leave something of themselves behind, to mark the moment, to insist against the indifference of time that they were here and that what they knew mattered. Inscription Rock is one of those places, and it may be the most layered of all of them. In western New Mexico, rising from the high desert plateau of the Colorado Plateau, with the sudden drama characteristic of this landscape, there is a sandstone mesa. It stands approximately 400 feet above the valley floor, its sheer walls dropping straight down to the sandy flats below. The rock is warm-colored, ochre and tan, and the deep burnt orange that New Mexico sandstone takes on in late afternoon light, and its vertical faces are smooth enough in places to have invited inscription for as long as human beings have stood at its base and looked up. The Acoma and Zuri peoples know this place by names that carry meaning their own traditions have defined across generations. It sits within a landscape that has been continuously inhabited by PBLO peoples and their ancestors for well over 1,000 years. The mesa itself, called El Morro by the Spanish and known more formally today as Inscription Rock, within El Morro National Monument, is significant first and most essentially as a place of indigenous meaning, a landmark in a landscape dense with cultural memory that predates every other layer of inscription on its walls by centuries. Because the walls of El Morro carry everything. At the base of the cliff face, near a natural water basin that has collected rainwater and snow, melt since long before any recorded human presence. There are petroglyphs, ancient ones carved into the sandstone surface in the tradition of the ancestral PBLO peoples, depicting figures, animals, handprints, and symbols that connect this site to the broader visual language of the Colorado Plateau's deep past. Some of these carvings date back 1,000 years or more. They are the foundation layer of a palimpsest that would continue accumulating for centuries. Above and alongside these indigenous inscriptions, beginning in the early 17th century, a new layer began to appear. Spanish explorers and colonial officials traveling the difficult route between the Rio Grande settlements and the Hopi and Zuri PBLO to the west discovered that the water basin at El Morro's base made it an essential stopping point in an otherwise brutal and waterless journey, and the smooth sandstone wall beside that water became for generations of Spanish travelers an irresistible surface for a very human impulse to record their passage, to leave their names, and compui the dates of their journeys, carved into the rock beside everyone who had come before. The earliest dated Spanish inscription is from 605, left by Juanate, the same conquistador whose soldiers encountered Etanoa 4 years earlier. His inscription records his passage to and from the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean, and it is followed over the next 2.5 centuries by the carved names and notations of governors, priests, soldiers, and settlers. Each one found the water, each one found the wall, each one added their mark to what was already there. Then, after 1848, when New Mexico passed from Spanish and Mexican governance into American hands, a third layer began. American soldiers, surveyors, and immigrants carved their names in English above and beside the Spanish inscriptions. Members of the United States Army Corps of Topographical Engineers left their marks here, the 1850s. Immigrants heading west added theirs. The wall absorbed everything. 3 languages, 3 colonial traditions, 3 centuries of travelers who found water in the desert and responded to the same impulse in the same way. What makes inscription rock extraordinary is not any single inscription, but the totality of the accumulation, the way it compresses centuries of human movement through a single landscape into one readable surface. Stand at the wall, and you are standing at a crossroads of time. The PBLO petroglyph and the Spanish colonial date and the American surveyor's name exist within feet of each other, separated not by distance, but only by the years that passed between them. Mainstream historical interpretation of El Morro is in this case unusually complete. The Spanish and American inscriptions are documented and largely legible. The indigenous petroglyphs, while not all interpreted with certainty, are situated within a well-studied regional tradition. The site does not generate the kind of contested fringe theories that surround Dion Rock or Mystery Hill, because the historical record here is rich enough to provide context for most of what is visible on the wall. But richness of record is not the same as completeness of understanding. The indigenous inscriptions at the base of the wall exist in a different relationship to history than the colonial layers above them. They were not made by people moving through. They were made by people for whom this landscape was home, for whom this mare was not a landmark on a journey, but a presence in a world they had known for generations beyond counting. The meaning encoded in those older carvings belongs to a tradition of knowledge that the historical record as compiled by outsiders has never fully captured. And there is something in the physical arrangement of the wall itself that invites reflection. The colonial inscriptions, Spanish, then American, climb upward from the waterline, accumulating above the older indigenous marks as the centuries progress. The sequence is not accidental. It mirrors in compressed form the larger history of this continent, a history in which one set of human expressions was gradually overlaid by another, without the earlier layer being erased, but without it being fully read either. The water is still there. The basin still collects what falls from the sky. Travelers still stop here, as they have stopped here for 1,000 years, and look at the wall. All those names, all those dates, all those figures carved before names and dates existed in this place. What does it mean that the oldest marks on this wall, the ones with the deepest roots in this landscape, are also the ones we understand least? And what might we finally begin to comprehend if we approach that oldest layer not as background to the history that came after it, but as the history itself? Inscription. Rock reminded us that the oldest marks on a surface are not always the ones we understand best. That depth of time does not guarantee clarity of meaning, and that the layers closest to the origin of a place are often the ones most thoroughly obscured by everything that accumulated above them. But what happens when there are no colonial layers, no Spanish dates, no English names, no convenient historical record to provide context or anchor the mystery in documented time? What happens when you stand before a carved surface and there is nothing between you and the ancient mind that made it? No intermediary tradition, no translating framework, no outside voice to tell you what you are looking at. What you are left with is the carving itself and the silence and the growing awareness that you may be looking at something important without possessing the first reliable tool for understanding what it means. That is the experience of Judacola Rock, and it is one of the most quietly overwhelming experiences available to anyone willing to find their way to a creekside field in the mountains of western North Carolina. The drive takes you into the southern Appalachians, a landscape of extraordinary age and beauty, one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, worn down by time into rounded forested ridges that fold into one another in every direction. This is Cherokee country, has been Cherokee country in the deepest sense of that phrase for longer than most. Archaeological timelines comfortably accommodate. The mountains here carry names, stories, and spiritual significance in the Cherokee tradition that reach back to the edges of oral memory, to a time when the world was organized differently, when the boundary between the human and non-human was more permeable than it is now. In a flat creekside meadow in Jackson County, partially submerged in wet ground and exposed to the sky, there is a large soapstone boulder. It is not dramatic in its dimensions, perhaps 16 feet long, 11 feet wide, rising only slightly above the surrounding field. It does not announce itself the way Monk's Mound or the Newark earthworks announce themselves. You could walk past it without understanding what you were seeing, but look at its surface, and the scale of what you are facing becomes immediately apparent. The entire exposed face of the rock, every available inch of it, is covered in carvings. Hundreds of them, perhaps more than 1,000 individual marks, depending on how you count, covering the soapstone in a density that is almost overwhelming to take in at once. Lines that curve and intersect, circles, what appear to be human figures, some with distinctive features, elongated fingers, unusual proportions, postures that suggest ceremony or transformation, marks that resemble nothing in any known iconographic tradition, and threading through all of it a sense of intentional organization, of a surface that was not randomly marked, but deliberately filled by minds that knew what they were doing and why. Judakala Rock takes its name from a figure in Cherokee spiritual tradition, Tulkalu anglicized as Judakula, a powerful being described as a slanty giant, a master of the hunt, a supernatural entity whose footprint is said to be visible on the rock's surface. Cherokee oral tradition connects this site directly to Judicula, describing it as his deed or land title, a record of his claim to the surrounding territory, marked in a language that exists between the human and the spirit world. This is not mythology offered as a substitute for archaeology. It is living cultural knowledge transmitted across generations by the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, whose ancestors made this rock, and whose descendants maintain relationship with it today. The Cherokee connection to Judicula Rock is not a theory, it is a fact of continuity, one that Western scholarship is only gradually learning to treat with the seriousness it deserves. Mainstream archaeological dating of the carvings has proven difficult, as it so often does, with petroglyphs. Soapstone does not lend itself to the same dating techniques that work for organic material. Stylistic analysis and the patentation of the carved surfaces suggests that the rock was carved over an extended period, not in a single session or even a single generation, but across centuries, possibly millennia. The oldest marks may date to 3000 BC or earlier. The most recent were likely added within the last few hundred years. The rock, like Jeffers and like Dian, is an accumulation, a record of sustained return to a significant place across an almost incomprehensible span of time. What the carvings mean in specific terms remains genuinely unresolved. Researchers have attempted systematic documentation of the markings, a task complicated by the weathering of the soapstone surface, by the difficulty of distinguishing ancient carvings from more recent damage, and by the sheer density and complexity of what is present. Photogrammetric mapping, using three-dimensional imaging technology, has revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Marks beneath marks, layers of inscription that confirm the long chronological reach of the site's use. Some of the figures have been compared to similar imagery found at other southeastern rock art sites, suggesting connections to a broader regional tradition. Others remain without parallel shapes and configurations that don't convince. Outside mainstream analysis, interpretations have ranged widely. Some researchers have proposed astronomical encoding, that the arrangement of marks on the rock surface reflects celestial knowledge, mapping star positions, or tracking seasonal cycles in a visual language we have not yet learned to read. Others have focused on the figure interpretations, seeing in the elongated, unusual human forms a record of spiritual beings or shamanic experience consistent with practices documented across indigenous traditions worldwide. A smaller number have suggested connections to other ancient writing systems, readings that the mainstream dismisses, but that continue to surface in the literature of alternative archaeology. What strikes many visitors, beyond any specific interpretive framework, is the emotional quality of the rock itself. Soapstone is a soft, tactile material, warm to the touch, in a way that harder stone is not. The carvings are intimate in their scale, made by hands working close to the surface, feeling the give of the stone beneath a tool. Standing beside Judaculla Rock, in the quiet of that creekside meadow, with the mountains folding away in every direction, and the Cherokee homeland pressing in from all sides, the distance between the present moment and the ancient one that produced these marks feels strangely, uncomfortably thin. Someone stood here, many someones across many centuries. They pressed tool to stone and moved with intention, filling this surface with something they needed to record, something urgent enough, or sacred enough, or true enough to be worth the labor of permanence. The eastern band of Cherokee are still here. The rock is still here. The marks are still here. And the question of what those marks say in their own language, on their own terms, without the distorting lens of every outside framework that has been placed over them, remains one that only deepens the longer and more carefully you look. What would it take to finally hear this rock in the language it was actually written in? Judaculla Rock asked us to consider what it would mean to hear an ancient message in the language it was actually written in, not filtered through outside frameworks, not translated into categories that belong to the interpreter rather than the maker, but received on its own terms, in its own voice, in the tradition from which it came. That question does not get easier as we move. If anything, it deepens, because the further we travel into these landscapes, and the longer we sit with these surfaces, the more apparent it becomes that the gap between what was recorded and what we are capable of receiving is not simply a gap of knowledge. It is a gap of orientation, of worldview, of the fundamental assumptions we carry about what rock art is for, what it records, and what kind of reality it was made to address. Nowhere is that gap more vividly felt than in the river valley we turn to now. Travel north across the American border into the Alberta plains of Canada and follow the Milk River as it cuts its slow, determined path through the high grassland. This is big sky country in the most literal sense, a landscape where the horizon is so distant and the sky so enormous that the human figure feels appropriately small, appropriately humble, appropriately aware of its place in something much larger than itself. The land is flat and open and ancient in a way that the body registers before the mind catches up. And then the river canyon opens and everything changes. The Milk River has spent millions of years carving through sandstone bedrock, creating a canyon system of hudas and carved walls and sheltered aloves that feels when you descend into it from the prairie above, like entering a different world entirely. The sandstone formations are extraordinary columns and mushroom shapes and sheer cliff faces, in warm, buff and gold, and the deep reddish-brown that certain sandstones take on in the long of late afternoon. The canyon holds warmth and shadow in ways the open prairie does not. It is by any measure a place that invites a different quality of attention. This is Writing on Stone Provincial Park, known to the Blackfoot people, whose ancestral territory this has been for centuries, as Azipi. The name translates roughly as it is written, or where the figures are drawn. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it contains the largest concentration of indigenous rock art on the entire North American Great Plains. More than 50 sites within the park holds and pictographs. The total number of individual images runs into the thousands carved and painted across the sandstone surfaces of the canyon walls, the olives, the sheltered faces that the river has, smoothed over millennia into surfaces as inviting as any canvas. Figures of humans and animals, battle scenes of extraordinary narrative detail, shields and weapons, spiritual beings, abstract symbols whose meaning lives in the Blackfoot tradition rather than in any external analytical framework. The Blackfoot, specifically the Nitsatapi, the collective of nations that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, maintain a living, active relationship with icy Nipi that is not historical but present. This is not an ancestral site in the distancing sense that term sometimes implies. It is a place of ongoing ceremonial significance, a location where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is understood to be thin in ways that the canyons, as geography, makes viscerally easy to believe. The Blackfoot have always known that this place is different from the surrounding landscape, that something in the rock, in the canyon, in the specific quality of the light, and the specific acoustics of the enclosed space opens a connection that is not available everywhere. Mainstream archaeology documents the rock art at writing on stone across a broad, chronological range. The oldest images may date back more than 3,000 years. The most recent were created within the last few centuries, some depicting horses, which confirms a post-1700 date for those specific images, since horses were reintroduced to the northern plains by Spanish expansion only in the late 17th century. The battle scenes in particular have attracted significant scholarly attention for the narrative detail they contain. Sequences of figures that appear to document specific conflicts, specific encounters, specific moments of historical event recorded in visual form by people who witness them. This is rock art as journalism, as historical record, as a form of documentation whose conventions we are still learning to read. But the older images beneath and alongside the more recent narrative scenes operate in a different register entirely. Figures that appear to be in states of transformation, part human, part animal, caught in the liminal space between forms. Beings with attributes that do not belong to the natural world, as ordinary experience defines it. Images that researchers working within the neuropsychological framework of rock art interpretation have associated with shamanic vision states. The altered consciousness, accessed through ceremony, through fasting, through the specific, spiritual practices that the Blackfoot tradition has maintained in its own form across generations. The canyon itself may have been selected precisely because of how it feels. Acoustics in enclosed sandstone spaces can produce unusual sonic effects, reverberations, and resonances that alter the experience of sound in ways that many cultures worldwide have associated with the presence of spirits or other than human forces. Researchers studying the relationship between rock art placement and acoustic properties have found suggestive correlations at sites across the world, including in the canyon systems of the northern plains. Whether the Blackfoot chose these specific surfaces partly because of how sound behaved against them is not something the archaeological record can confirm. But it is a question that the canyon, if you stand in it quietly enough, seems to ask of its own accord. Some of the images at writing on stone have never been publicly documented, kept within the knowledge of the Blackfoot community as sacred information not intended for outside circulation. This is not obstruction. It is the entirely reasonable maintenance of a boundary between what belongs to the world at large and what belongs to the tradition that created it. The park's management reflects this, developed in close partnership with the Blackfoot nations in a model of collaborative stewardship that acknowledges the limits of what outside scholarship has the right to access or interpret. The canyon holds its own counsel. The Hudos cast their shadows across the carved walls as the sun moves. The river continues its patient erosion of the sandstone, deepening the canyon millimeter by millimeter in the same direction it has always moved. Thousands of images, thousands of years, a living tradition that never left. And somewhere in the aloes and sheltered faces of that canyon, images that no researcher has yet studied, meanings that exist in the rock and in the knowledge of the people whose ancestors put them there, waiting not for discovery, but for a different quality of relationship than discovery implies. What does it mean to protect a mystery rather than solve it? And is it possible that some of what we are looking for was never meant to be found by looking, but only by belonging. Writing on stone left us with a question about belonging, about whether some knowledge is meant to be protected rather than extracted, held rather than analyzed, lived rather than studied from the outside. It asked us to consider the limits of what scholarship can reach, and whether those limits are a failure of method or a boundary that deserves to be respected. That question stays with us as we move west and south, deeper into the arid interior of the continent, into a landscape that operates on terms entirely its own. Because what we find here shares the same essential impulse as everything we have seen, the human need to mark, to record, to reach across time through the medium of rock and pigment, but carries it into a context so remote, so spare, and so ancient that it strips the question down to something almost elemental. Leave the Canadian plains and travel into California's San Joaquin Valley, not the agricultural flatlands most people know, but the western edge, where the valley floor begins to rise toward the coast ranges through a terrain of dry rolling hills covered in sparse grass and scattered oak. The land here is golden in summer, green for a brief season, and winter, and always in every season, saturated with a quality of light that feels older than the landscape it illuminates. This is not a dramatic environment in the way that canyon country is dramatic. It is quiet, understated, the kind of place that rewards slow attention. In Ciso Plain National Monument, within a natural depression formed by the geology of the San Andreas Fault Zone, there is an outcropping of sandstone that rises from the valley floor with modest but unmistakable presence. It is not enormous. It does not dominate the landscape around it, but its south-facing surface, sheltered from the worst of the weather by a slight overhang, warmed by the sun through most of the day, smooth enough to have invited human attention across centuries, is covered in some of the most vivid and visually complex rock art in North America. This is painted rock, and the paintings on its walls belong to the Chumash people, one of the most sophisticated maritime and ceremonial cultures of the California coast and interior, whose traditional territory stretched from Malibu to St. Louis Obispo and inland across the transverse ranges and into the edges of the San Joaquin Valley. Where we now stand, the images are painted rather than carved, applied in red, black, and white pigments derived from mineral and organic sources, in colors that have held against the sandstone surface for centuries with a durability that still surprises researchers who study pigment preservation in open-air environments. They are densely arranged, overlapping in places, suggesting multiple episodes of painting across an extended period of time. Human figures, geometric shapes of extraordinary intricacy, sunbursts, pinwheels, concentric circles, cross-hatched forms, animals, including what appear to be insects, rendered with unusual specificity, and beings that resist simple categorization. Composite figures, shapes that hover between the representational and the abstract, images that operate in a visual register not quite like anything in the surrounding natural world. Mainstream archaeology situates the painted rock images within the Chumash rock art tradition, which is among the most studied and most visually distinctive indigenous art traditions in North America. The Chumash were not a simple hunter-gatherer society in the reductive sense that term is sometimes applied. They maintained sophisticated trade networks, constructed plank canoes of remarkable engineering for open-water ocean travel, developed a shell bead currency system that functioned across a wide regional economy, and sustained a ceremonial and intellectual tradition of genuine complexity, one centered on the observation of astronomical phenomena and the ritual management of the relationship between the human community and the forces that govern the natural world. The Antop, a Chumash ceremonial organization whose members functioned as priests, astronomers, and ritual specialists, are understood by researchers to have been the primary creators of the rock art tradition. The paintings are interpreted as products of shamanic vision states, records of experience accessed through ceremony, fasting, and the use of deta, a powerful and dangerous hallucinogenic plant that the Chumash used in controlled ritual contexts to facilitate encounters with what their tradition understood as the spirit world. This interpretation is not speculative in the dismissive sense. It is grounded in ethnographic documentation, in Chumash oral tradition, and in the cross-cultural research on the relationship between altered states of consciousness and rock art production that has developed significantly over the past 4 decades. The images at Painted Rock are within this framework, not decorative. They are not casual. They are records of specific experiences, of specific encounters with specific forces, rendered in a visual language developed over centuries of practice and transmitted through a tradition of initiation and knowledge. What remains genuinely mysterious is the specific content of those records, the geometric complexity of many Chumo's images, the precise multi-element compositions that appear on surfaces like painted rock, has attracted the attention of researchers interested in their potential astronomical encoding. Some scholars have proposed that specific images function as solar or lunar markers activated by the way light falls on the painted surface at particular moments in the astronomical calendar. Work conducted at a related Chumash site, Burrow Flats, has documented a solstice light phenomenon in which a shaft of sunlight illuminates a specific painted image with precision, suggesting deliberate design. Whether similar intentional light interactions are present at Painted Rock has been the subject of ongoing research, with some investigators finding suggestive evidence and others urging caution about over-interpretation. Outside the mainstream, some researchers have pointed to the visual complexity of certain Painted Rock images, particularly the multi-element geometric compositions, as evidence of a more formalized, symbolic system than the shamanic vision interpretation alone can account for. The question of whether Chumash rock art encodes information in a systematic way that could be considered a proto-writing system has been raised carefully and without definitive resolution by a small number of scholars working at the intersection of cognitive archaeology and indigenous knowledge systems. The rock itself has not survived the centuries unharmed. Vandalism has damaged significant portions of the painted surface, a loss that is in the context of everything we have explored on this journey, particularly painful to contemplate. What remains is a fraction of what once existed. The colors are faded in places, obscured in others. The layered record of Chumash ceremonial life partially erased by the casual destructiveness of people who did not understand or did not care what they were standing in front of. The valley holds the silence that follows that kind of loss. The sandstone is still warm in the afternoon sun. The paintings that remain are still vivid enough in the right light to carry something of the force they were made to carry. Someone stood here, many someones across many generations, in states of consciousness that the modern world has largely lost access to, and painted what they saw, painted it carefully, deliberately, with materials chosen for durability, in compositions organized with evident intention. They wanted this to last. They wanted whatever they had witnessed to be available to those who came after. What did they see? And are we still in any meaningful sense capable of receiving it? Painted Rock asked us to sit with loss, with the painful reality that what survives of these ancient records is always less than what existed, always a fraction of an original wholeness that we can sense but never fully recover. It asks us what it means to receive a message that has been partially erased, and whether we are still capable of being open to what remains. Now we go somewhere that has not been erased, somewhere that the remoteness of the landscape itself has protected, where the difficulty of arrival has functioned for thousands of years as a kind of guardian. A place so far from the roots of casual human traffic that what was painted on its walls has survived with a completeness and an immediacy that when you finally stand before it, stops you in a way that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. To reach the Great Gallery, you must want to be there. The approach is through canyon lands. the southeastern Utah Canyon country that represents one of the most geologically dramatic and humanly inhospitable landscapes on the North Crest. American continent, the Colorado River, and the Green River have spent millions of years cutting through the Colorado Plateau here, creating a labyrinth of measy walls and narrow corridors of exposed sandstone that disorient even experienced navigators. The light in this landscape is extraordinary. The rock is red and orange, and the particular deep burgundy that Utah sandstone achieves in some shadow. And the sky above it is a blue so saturated it reads almost as a separate substance, something poured rather than merely present. Horseshoe Canyon is a detached unit of Canyonlands National Park, separated from the main sections of the park by miles of roadless terrain. To reach the Great Gallery requires a hike of several miles down into the canyon and along its sandy floor, through cottonwoods, in silence, and the growing awareness that the walls closing in, around you, have been holding this space for a very long time. And then you see them on a sheltered wall of Navajo sandstone, in an alcove that faces roughly east and catches the morning light in a way that feels deliberate. A procession of figures stretches for nearly 300 feet. They are large, some of them life-sized, some larger, painted in deep red and burgundy pigments that have held against the rock surface for what researchers estimate to be between 2,000 and 7,000 years. They are elongated, stylized, profoundly, unmistakably strange. These are the Holy Ghost panel and the associated figures of the Great Gallery, the masterwork of what archaeologists call the Barrier Canyon style, a rock art tradition found across southeastern Utah and neighboring regions that represents one of the most distinctive and most debated artistic traditions in all of North American prehistory. The figures are humanoid, but not human, at least not human in any ordinary sense. They have no arms, or arms that taper to nothing without hands. They have large, dark, forward-facing eyes, sometimes described as goggle-like, set in elongated heads that in some figures seem to merge with or emerge from the rock itself. Some carry objects, what appear to be plants, snakes, or ceremonial items. Some are accompanied by smaller figures that hover near them in arrangement suggesting relationship or hierarchy. Some have antennae, some appear to float. The largest figure in the Great Gallery, sometimes called the Holy Ghost itself, stands approximately 7 feet tall. It dominates the panel with a presence that is not aggressive, but is in the clearest possible sense overwhelming. People who have stood before it across many different cultural backgrounds and interpretive frameworks have consistently reported the same thing, that it feels like being looked at, that, whatever was intended in the making of this figure, one of its effects is the distinct and settling sensation of encounter. Mainstream archaeology situates the Barrier Canyon style within a broad tradition of archaic, period rock art in the Colorado Plateau region. The figures are interpreted as supernatural beings, deities, spirits, or other than human forces recognized within the belief systems of the people who painted them. The elongated armless form may represent beings in a state of spiritual power, or figures seen in visionary states, or entities that exist in a cosmological register distinct from ordinary human form. The scale of the figures, their insistence on presence, their refusal of smallness, is understood as reflecting the importance of what they represent, rather than any attempt at realistic depiction. Who precisely made them remains unknown. The Barrier Canyon style predates the cultures whose descendants are identifiable in the historical record of the region. The Fremont people, the ancestral Puebloans, the Ute, all have connections to this landscape, but none have been definitively identified as the makers of the Barrier Canyon tradition. It exists in the archaeological record as a cultural expression without a clearly named author. That anonymity is part of what makes the Great Gallery so disquing. Outside mainstream interpretation, the figures have attracted the full range of alternative theorizing that attends any sufficiently strange and ancient image. The goggle eyes and elongated forms have been cited by some researchers as evidence of contact with non-human intelligences, a fringe interpretation that mainstream archaeology firmly rejects, but that continues to circulate, driven by the genuine visual strangeness of the figures and the human tendency to reach for the most dramatic available explanation when the conventional ones feel insufficient. More grounded alternative interpretations focus on the neuropsychological framework, the idea that the figures represent beings encountered in shamanic vision states, their specific formal qualities reflecting the architecture of altered human consciousness rather than any external entity. Within this framework, the goggle eyes may reflect the visual phenomena associated with deep trance states, and the floating armless forms may capture the somatic experience of consciousness temporarily freed from ordinary bodily sensation. Neither interpretation can be proven. Both address something real about the visual experience of standing before these figures, their capacity to produce in the viewer a feeling of contact with something outside ordinary categories of understanding. The morning light moves across the panel as the sun rises above the canyon rim. The pigment catches it differently at different angles, the figures seeming to advance and recede as the illumination shifts, as if something in them is still in motion after all these centuries. 300 feet of figures, thousands of years of survival in one of the most remote places in North America. A tradition without a named author, a meaning without a confirmed interpretation, a presence that continues to produce, in everyone who reaches it, the same quality of arrested attention. What were they painting toward? What did they understand about the nature of existence that required figures of this size, this strangeness, this insistence on being seen? And why, after everything, after all the weathering and the silence and the millennia of nobody looking, do they still feel so completely, so uncomfortably, like they are looking back? The Great Gallery held us in that particular stillness that only the most ancient and most deliberately made things can produce. The feeling of being addressed across an expanse of time so vast that the normal categories of past and present begin to lose their meaning. The figures on that horseshoe canyon wall were not background. They were not decoration. They were in some sense that resists clean articulation, still present, still doing whatever it was they were made to do. And that quality of presence, of intention that outlasts the life of the person who carried it, is something we encounter again as we turn northeast, leaving the canyon country of Utah behind, and moving into a landscape that carries its own particular weight of accumulated time, a landscape that looks on the surface like the open and uncomplicated country of the northern plains, but which conceals in the sandstone rimrock along its river valleys evidence of human habitation so deep and so continuous that it reframes everything we think we know about the settlement of this part of the continent. We are going to Montana now, to the rimrock country, south of Billings, where the Yellowstone River moves through a wide valley, bounded by sandstone cliffs that the wind and water have carved over millions of years into forms that suggest, if you are in the right frame of mind, the ruins of something intentional. The cliffs are warm-colored, buff and cream, and the particular pale orange that certain Montana sandstones achieve in full sun, and they are riddled with caves and sheltered olives that have provided protection from the elements since the first human beings found their way into this valley. In one of those aloves, a shallow cave, perhaps 60 feet wide and 15 feet deep, its floor several feet above the valley bottom, its opening facing south toward the light. There is evidence of human presence spanning more than 9,000 years, continuous presence, unbroken occupation, or return across a stretch of time that reaches back to the earliest confirmed habitation of the northern plains through every subsequent cultural period into the era of historical documentation and right up to the edge of living memory. This is Pictograph Cave, and what it contains in its stratigraphy, in its artifacts, in the images, on its walls, is one of the most complete and most intimate records of long-term human life in the American Northwest. The cave system actually consists of 3 separate caves: Pictograph Cave, Middle Cave, and Ghost Cave, arranged along the base of the rimrock, in a configuration that sheltered people from wind, rain, and cold across an almost incomprehensible span of seasons. Excavations conducted beginning in the 1930s and continuing with more sophisticated methodology in subsequent decades recovered more than 30,000 artifacts from the cave floor, a density of material culture that reflects the site's role not as a seasonal camp, but as a place of genuine sustained importance to the people who return to it generation after generation. The artifacts tell a story of remarkable continuity and equally remarkable change. Projectile points spanning the full chronological range of plains technology, from the large, carefully worked points of the Paleo-Indian period, through the smaller, more refined forms of the Archaic, and into the arrow points of the late prehistoric era, appear in stratigraphic sequence that reads like a textbook of technological evolution. Animal bones document the changing fauna of the northern plains across 9 millennia. Tools of bone and shell and stone reflect the shifting material culture of successive peoples, each adapting the resources of this landscape to the needs of their particular moment. But what gives Pictograph Cave its name, and what draws visitors and researchers back to it with a persistence that the artifact collection alone might not generate, are the images on the cave walls. More than 100 pictographs survive on the sandstone surfaces of Pictograph Cave, painted in red, white, and black pigments, whose mineral origins have been analyzed and confirmed as consistent with materials available in the surrounding landscape. The images include human figures in a range of postures and activities, animals, elk, deer, bison, and what appear to be dogs or wolves, rendered with varying degrees of naturalism. Shields of a distinctive form, associated with the shield-bearing warrior tradition of the northern plains, and figures that combine human and animal attributes in ways that suggest the same liminal transformative states we have encountered at writing on stone, at Jeffers, at the Great Gallery. Some of the pictographs have been dated through analysis of the pigment layers and their relationship to the archaeological stratigraphy to approximately 900 years ago. Others appear more recent. The layering of images, some painted over earlier compositions, some occupying spaces that earlier painters left open, mirrors the pattern we have seen at every major rock art site on this journey. Pictograph Cave was not painted once. It was painted continuously, returned to, and added to across centuries by people who understood themselves as participating in something already underway, something larger than any individual act of image-making. Mainstream archaeology interprets the pictographs within the context of the broader Northern Plains rock art tradition, a tradition practiced by the ancestors of the Crow, Blackfoot, Lakota, and other Plains nations whose territories include or border this region. The Crow people maintain a particular cultural connection to this area, and their oral traditions include knowledge of this landscape that predates any written record by generations. Collaborative work between archaeologists and Crow cultural knowledge holders has enriched the interpretation of some of the site's imagery in ways that purely external analysis could not achieve. What the mainstream framework addresses with confidence is the what and the when of Pictograph Cave. What it addresses with less certainty is the why, the specific ritual or ceremonial logic that brought people back to this particular cave across 9,000 years with enough consistency to leave the archaeological record that survives there today. Some researchers have pointed to the acoustic properties of the cave as a potentially significant factor in its selection. The sandstone alcove creates a resonance chamber that amplifies and transforms sound in ways that enclosed rock spaces frequently do. The same phenomenon that has been noted at sites from the canyon country of Utah to the megalithic monuments of Western Europe. Whether the pictograph cave alcove was chosen partly for its sonic qualities, and whether ceremony conducted there incorporated sound in ways that the acoustic environment would have enhanced, is a question that has been raised but not resolved. Others have focused on the visual experience of the cave in firelight, on the way that painted figures on curved sandstone surfaces illuminated by flickering flame rather than the flat diffusion of modern electric light would have appeared to move, to breathe, to exist in a relationship with the viewer fundamentally different from the static images we see, daylight to day. Experimental work at comparable sites has suggested that the visual effect of firelit painted caves is dramatic enough to constitute a genuinely different perceptual experience, one that the people who designed and used these spaces may have understood and intentionally cultivated outside the mainstream. The 9,000-year span of occupation at Pictograph Cave has attracted attention from researchers interested in the deep prehistory of the northern plains and the question of which cultures were present in this region before the peoples identified in the historical record. The stratigraphic depth of the artifact sequence at Pictograph Cave reaches back to a period when the identity of the people living on the northern plains is genuinely uncertain, when the cultural landscape was different enough from what came later that the connections between Paleo-Indian occupants and the historically documented nations of the region cannot be drawn in straight lines. Who were the first people to shelter in this cave? Who first looked at its sandstone walls and felt the impulse to paint something there to add their mark to a surface that would eventually hold 9,000 years of human return? We don't know their names. We don't know their language. We don't know what they called this place, or what it meant to them to find shelter here, in a landscape that was in their time still settling into the form we recognize today. But they were here. The artifacts confirm it. The pigment on the walls confirms it. And somewhere in the deepest layer of that cave floor beneath everything that came after, the first human presence in this particular shelter waits, patient, anonymous, and more foundational than anything we have yet managed to fully understand. What would it mean to know that first-person story? And how different might our understanding of this entire landscape look if we could hear it, told in their own words? Pictograph Cave held us in the deep time of the northern plains, 9,000 years of return of human presence, accumulating in layers beneath a painted sandstone ceiling, each generation adding its mark to something already ancient when they arrived. It reminded us that continuity is itself a kind of knowledge, that the act of coming back, of choosing the same place across centuries, encodes something about the meaning of that place that no single artifact can fully express. Now we go west again, back across the Rockies, back into the arid interior of the American West, into a landscape so extreme in its conditions and so remote in its geography that it has kept its secrets more completely than almost anywhere else we have visited, a place where the desert is not merely dry, but geologically violent, where volcanic activity has shaped the surface into forms that look in certain light less like Earth and more like the aftermath of something catastrophic, where the silence is the kind that has weight and texture, where the human presence, when you find evidence of it, feels both incongruous and inevitable. Because people have always found their way to the places that matter, no matter how difficult the terrain insists on being. We are going to the Coso Range, a cluster of volcanic mountains in the high desert of Inyo County in eastern California, bounded to the west by the Sierra Nevada and to the east by the Mojave Desert, sitting in a basin of ancient lakebed sediment that records a wetter, more generous climate than anything this landscape has known for thousands of years. The Coso Range is geologically active. Hot springs still bubble at its edges, and the volcanic rock that covers its surface is dark and glassy, the kind of stone that holds heat through the night and radiates it back in waves that shimmer above the desert floor in the Zona Rolf. Most of the Coso Range lies within the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station, a vast restricted military installation that has, whatever its other effects on the landscape, functioned as an inadvertent preservation mechanism for what the volcanic canyon walls of the Coso Range contain. Because access is controlled, and has been for decades, the rock art of the Coso district has been protected from the casual vandalism that has damaged sites like Painted Rock and countless others across the western United States. The isolation that makes it difficult to visit is the same isolation that has allowed it to survive, and what has survived is staggering. The Coso Rock Art District contains an estimated 100,000 individual petroglyphs carved into the dark desert varnish that coats the volcanic rock surfaces of the canyon walls throughout the range. 100,000 images distributed across dozens of canyon sites, representing what is by most measures the largest concentration of rock art in North America, and one of the largest in the world. The carvings span a chronological range that researchers estimate between 16,000 and 1,000 years, a span so vast that the oldest images, if the dating holds, were made during the last ice age by two people living in a landscape that included now extinct megafauna and a climate nothing like what exists there today. The dominant image in the Coso corpus, appearing with a frequency and consistency that immediately arrests the attention of anyone who studies the site, is the bighorn sheep. Thousands of them depicted in profile, in groups, in isolation, in compositions that range from simple outlines to elaborately detailed renderings, with interior patterning and associated human or supernatural figures. The bighorn sheep appears at Coso in numbers and with a visual emphasis that far exceeds any other subject, raising a question that has generated one of the most sustained and productive debates in American rock art research. Why bighorn sheep, and why here, in these specific canyons, in these specific quantities? The mainstream archaeological explanation, developed most fully by researchers David, Whitley, and others working within the ethnographic context of the Numic-speaking peoples, whose ancestors occupied this region, centers on the practice of shamanic rainkeeping. The Kawaiisu, Shoshone, and Puta peoples of the Coso region maintained a ceremonial tradition in which shamans, spiritual practitioners who accessed power through vision states, worked to bring rain to an arid landscape by hunting bighorn sheep in the spirit world. The bighorn in this tradition was associated with water and rain-bringing power. The act of depicting bighorn sheep in rock art was itself a form of ceremonial hunting, a way of capturing and directing the rain-bringing power of the animal in the spirit realm with consequences in the physical world. This interpretation is not speculation imposed from outside. It is grounded in the ethnographic record of the region's indigenous peoples, in the documented practices of Numic shamanism, and in the specific visual characteristics of the Coso images, many of which show bighorn sheep, in postures and contexts consistent with the ceremonial framework, rather than simple, naturalistic depiction. It represents one of the more complete and culturally grounded explanations available for any major rock art tradition in North America. But the sheer scale of the Coso district, 100,000 images across 16,000 years, exceeds what any single explanatory framework can fully accommodate. Because the rainkeeping interpretation, however well supported, applies most clearly to the more recent layers of the Coso corpus, the images that fall within the cultural period of the Numic peoples and their immediate predecessors. The oldest images at Coso, if the most ambitious dating estimates are correct, predate Numic occupation of the region by thousands of years. They were made by people whose identity, whose language, whose belief systems are genuinely unknown. People so remote in time that they belong to a period of North American prehistory for which we have almost no cultural framework at all. What were those earliest carvers doing in these volcanic canyons? What drew them here, to these specific canyon walls, with an impulse powerful enough to initiate a tradition of return that would continue through cultural change, through climate change, through the replacement of one human population by another, for the better part of 16 millennia. Some researchers have proposed that the Coso Range itself was the draw, that the volcanic activity, the hot springs, the geologically anomalous character of the landscape made it a place of spiritual power in the most immediate and sensory sense. Landscapes that behave unusually, that produce heat from the ground, that smell of sulfur, that generate sounds and phenomena not found in ordinary terrain, have been recognized as spiritually significant by cultures worldwide. The Coso Range may have functioned as what some researchers call a power place, a location whose physical properties made it across many different cultural frameworks in many different centuries. A site where the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it felt demonstrably thin. The desert varnish that coats the volcanic rock, the dark manganese-rich patina that the petroglyphs were carved into by removing the surface, layer to reveal the lighter stone beneath, accumulates extremely slowly, at rates that make precise dating of individual images extraordinarily difficult. New dating methodologies, including accelerator mass spectrometry, applied to the varnish itself, have produced dates that continue to push the oldest images further back in time, deepening the mystery of who was here and when. Outside the mainstream, the volume and variety of Coso imagery has attracted the full range of alternative interpretation. Some researchers have pointed to certain images, particularly geometric forms and figures in unusual postures, as evidence of contact with non-human intelligence, an interpretation that mainstream archaeology consistently rejects, but that recurs in the Spenge popular literature with a persistence reflecting genuine public fascination with the site's visual strangeness. More measured alternative approaches have focused on the possibility that the Coso corpus encodes astronomical information, that the distribution and orientation of certain panels reflects knowledge of celestial cycles encoded in the landscape itself, accessible to those who knew how to read the relationship between the carved surfaces and the sky above them. 100,000 images carved across a span of time longer than all of recorded human history, by people whose names we do not know, in a language we have not deciphered, for purposes that our best scholarship has partially illuminated and only partially understood. The volcanic canyons hold their heat long after the sun goes down. The carved sheep move across the dark stone in the beam of a flashlight the way they must have moved by firelight, flickering, almost animate, almost present. What did it mean to the first person who carved here, 16,000 years ago, to make that first mark on this particular rock in this particular canyon? And is it possible that whatever they understood about this place, whatever drew them here, and kept drawing people back across all those centuries, is still present in the stone, waiting not for a better dating method, but for a different quality of attention entirely? The Coso Range asked us to consider what it means when a place draws people back across 16,000 years, when the accumulation of human return becomes so dense, so layered, so vast in its chronological reach, that the very scale of it begins to feel like its own kind of message. 100,000 images carved into volcanic stone, by hand, spanning more time than recorded history can compass. The question it left us with was not about method, or dating, or cultural affiliation. It was about attention, about whether we are capable of the quality of presence that a place like that demands. Now we move slightly north and west, staying in California, but leaving the high desert behind, descending from the volcanic ranges toward a landscape that operates in an entirely different register, softer, greener, more intimate in its scale. The eastern foothills of the California Coast Ranges are not the dramatic canyon country of Utah or the geologically violent terrain of the Coso Range. They are rolling hills covered in oak woodland and chaparral, cut through by seasonal streams that run clear in winter and slow to a whisper by midsummer. It is a landscape that rewards a different quality of attention than the desert, quieter, more enclosed, more likely to reveal its secrets to someone willing to move slowly. and look carefully, rather than scan wide horizons for dramatic formations. In the Diablo Range of Central California, within what is now Pinnacles National Park, a network of caves and rock shelters formed by ancient volcanic activity and subsequent erosion winds through the Chaparral Hills in a configuration that has no real parallel elsewhere in the big California landscape. The caves themselves are tuss caves, formed not by water-dissolving limestone, as most caves are, but by massive boulders tumbling and wedging against one another to create enclosed spaces of surprising size and complexity. The rock is volcanic breccia, rough, dark, porous, geologically restless, in a way that the enduring landscape's history of seismic and volcanic activity has written into every surface. And in one of those cave systems, in a sheltered alcove, where the light enters at a particular angle and the rock surface smooths enough to have invited human attention, there are paintings. This is Bear Gulch, a site within Pinnacles whose pictographs represent one of the least studied and most visually distinctive rock art traditions in California. The paintings are not on a grand scale. This is not the Great Gallery, with its 300 feet of monumental figures. This is something more intimate, more private almost, in the quality of the space that contains it. The alcove is enclosed. The ceiling is low enough in places that you are aware of the rock above you in a way that changes how you hold your body, how you breathe, how you orient your attention. It is the kind of space that does something to human consciousness simply by virtue of its physical properties, that creates without any cultural instruction a sense of enclosure and interiority that feels meaningful. The paintings themselves are rendered primarily in red ochre, the iron oxide pigment that appears across rock art traditions on every inhabited continent, suggesting something so fundamental about its visual properties and its availability that its use may be less a cultural choice than a near-universal human response to the need to make a mark that lasts. The images include geometric forms, grids, zigzags, dot patterns, concentric shapes, and more representational elements that researchers have associated with the Shaolin and Mutsunlone peoples, whose ancestral territory encompasses this region of the California Coast Ranges. The Alone, a collective name for a group of related but linguistically distinct peoples who inhabited the San Francisco Bay Area and the Central California coast, are among the most poorly documented of California's indigenous nations, in part because the catastrophic disruption of the mission system, which concentrated and decimated coastal California populations beginning in the late 18th century, destroyed much of the cultural continuity that might otherwise have preserved detailed knowledge of sites like Bear Gulch. What survives of a lone ceremonial tradition is fragmentary, recovered through the work of ethnographers who arrived after the worst of the disruption, and through the ongoing efforts of alone communities working to reconstruct and maintain their cultural heritage in the face of that loss. This fragmentary documentation makes the interpretation of the Bear Gulch pictographs genuinely difficult in ways that differ from the interpretive challenges at sites like Coso or Writing on Stone, where the cultural continuity between makers and living descendants is stronger. At Bear Gulch, the link between the images and the tradition that produced them has been partially severed. Not completely, but enough that the paintings exist in a space of interpretive uncertainty that requires particular care and particular honesty about what we do and do not know. Mainstream analysis of the Bear Gulch pictographs has focused on stylistic comparison with other California rock art traditions, particularly the broader Central California rock art corpus that includes sites in the Sierra Nevada foothills and the inner coast ranges. The geometric forms at Bear Gulch appear in contexts that researchers have associated with initiation ceremonies, with the marking of sacred or restricted spaces, and with the visual documentation of vision states accessed through the use of dita, the same plant that played a central role in the Chumash ceremonial tradition we encountered at Painted Variable. rock, and which appears with remarkable consistency across the rock art producing cultures of Southern and Central California. The specific placement of the paintings within the Bear Gulch cave system has attracted attention from researchers interested in the relationship between enclosed spaces and altered states of consciousness. The cave environment, with its controlled light, its acoustic enclosure, its physical separation from the ordinary sensory world of the landscape outside, creates conditions that cross-cultural research on shamanic practice has consistently identified as conducive to the kind of perceptual shift that vision ceremonies are designed to produce. The paintings may not simply record what was seen in those states. They may have been made in those states in the space where the experience was occurring as a form of simultaneous documentation and ritual action. This interpretation, while not provable from the archaeological record alone, fits what we know of the broader California ceremonial tradition and aligns with the documented practices of neighboring peoples whose cultural continuity is stronger than that of the Olan. Outside the mainstream, the Bear Gulch pictographs have attracted relatively less alternative theorizing than more dramatically scaled or more accessibly located sites. A function perhaps of the intimacy of the space and the modest scale of the paintings, which do not immediately suggest the kind of cosmic ambition that draws fringe interpretation to places like the Great Gallery or Mystery Hill. What alternative researchers have noted is the precision of certain geometric forms, the regularity of grid patterns, and the consistency of certain repeated motifs, which some have suggested implies a more formalized symbolic system than the vision state interpretation alone can account for. Whether the geometric vocabulary of Bear Gulch encodes information in a systematic way, or whether its forms are the natural visual output of certain universal patterns of altered human perception, is a question that the paintings themselves do not resolve. What the space does resolve, not intellectually, but experientially, for anyone who spends time in it, is the question of why here. The Bear Gulch alcove is the kind of place that selects for itself. You do not stumble into it without noticing that something about it is different. The enclosure, the quality of the light, the way sound behaves against the volcanic rock walls. These are not incidental features of a convenient shelter. They are the reason the shelter was chosen. The place made itself available for a particular kind of use, and the people who found it recognized what it was offering. The paintings are faded now. Some are difficult to make out without careful attention and favorable lighting. They do not announce themselves the way the Great Gallery announces itself, or the way the Newark earthworks announce themselves from above. They require patience. They require willingness to let your eyes adjust, to let the space settle around you, to stop imposing your own pace on a place that operates on a different rhythm entirely. And when you do, when the patience finally yields, and the images begin to clarify against the dark volcanic surface, what you see is not an exhibition. It is not a record kept for outsiders. It is something made for the space it inhabits and the consciousness it was designed to meet. Who was that consciousness, and what did they find here in this enclosed volcanic dark that was worth marking on the wall forever? Bear Gulch asked us to slow down, to let the space settle around us before we tried to read what it contained. It reminded us that some of these ancient places do not yield their meaning to the impatient visitor, that what was made in altered states of consciousness and intimate ceremonial enclosure may require something closer to that quality of attention before it begins to communicate across the distance of centuries. We carry that slower pace with us now as we move northeast, out of California's coastal ranges and across the basin and range country of the interior west, climbing back toward the high plains, back toward the open sky country, where the land asserts itself horizontally rather than vertically. We are heading into Wyoming, into a landscape that most people pass through rather than stop in. The kind of terrain that reads from a highway as simply space between destinations, but which reveals to anyone willing to leave the road and walk the dry creek beds and sandstone ridge, lines a depth of human history as rich as anywhere on the continent. In Hot Springs County, in north-central Wyoming, where the Bighorn Basin opens between the Absaroka Range to the west and the Bighorn Mountains to the east, a seasonal creek, called Cottonwood Creek, cuts through a sandstone formation that has been collecting the marks of human attention for a very long time. The creek runs intermittently, generous in spring snowmelt, reduced to pools, and then to nothing by the height of summer. But its presence, even seasonal, has made this a reliable stopping point in an otherwise demanding landscape. Water draws people. People, when they stop, look at the walls around them, and walls like these smooth sandstone faces, dark with desert varnish, inclined at angles that invite close approach, invite a response. The response here has been accumulating for at least 10,000 years. This is Legend Rock, a petroglyph site comprising more than 50 individual panels spread across a sandstone cliff face, roughly 200 feet long, containing nearly 300 distinct carved images that together represent one of the most significant and most chronologically diverse rock art assemblages on the northern plains. The site was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1973, and it is managed by the Wyoming State Park System, open to visitors, documented, studied, and recognized as important in the formal institutional sense. And yet, it remains in the ways that matter most, genuinely and deeply mysterious. The carvings at Legend Rock span a time frame that researchers have estimated at between 5,000 and 10,000 years, a range comparable to Jeffers, to the Coso Range, to writing on stone, each of which we have seen accumulate its record through the sustained return of generation after generation to a surface already understood as significant. The oldest images at Legend Rock belong to a tradition that predates the historically documented cultures of the Bighorn Basin region by thousands of years. Carvings made by people whose specific cultural identity is unknown, whose connection to the peoples of the historical record cannot be traced in straight lines, whose presence here is documented by the marks they left and by almost nothing else. The imagery is varied in a way that reflects the site's long chronological reach. Animal figures appear throughout: elk, deer, bison, and mountain sheep, rendered in styles that shift across the centuries. From the heavily pecked, deeply incised forms of the oldest layers to the more refined outlines of later periods. Human figures appear in hunting scenes, in ceremonial postures, in compositions that suggest narrative, that imply a before and after, a sequence of events that the carver wanted to preserve in a form that would outlast the telling. And then there are the anthropomorphs, the figures that most consistently draw the attention of researchers and visitors alike at Legend Rock are the large, front-facing humanoid forms that appear at several points along the cliff face, figures rendered with a formal, almost hieratic quality that sets them apart from the more naturalistic animal depictions surrounding them. Some have elaborate headdresses or radiating lines extending from the head. Some have interior body patterning, lines and shapes within the torso outline that suggest either clothing, body paint, or something less literally representational. Some are depicted with what appear to be horns, or antlers, or other attributes that mark them as belonging to a category distinct from ordinary human experience. Mainstream archaeology interprets these figures within the context of the broader plains, rock art tradition, as supernatural beings, as shamanic practitioners, depicted in states of spiritual power, as the visual vocabulary of a ceremonial tradition concerned with the relationship between human communities and the forces that governed hunting, weather, and the general condition of life in a demanding environment. The front-facing, formally composed quality of the figures is understood as reflecting their status, as marking them as entities of power rather than ordinary persons engaged in ordinary activity. The Shoshone and Arapjo peoples, whose territories include the Bighorn Basin region, maintain cultural connections to this landscape that inform the interpretation of sites like Legend Rock, within living indigenous knowledge frameworks. For these communities, the site is not a historical curiosity, but a place of ongoing spiritual significance, a location where something of the power that produced the original carvings continues to be present and accessible. Radiocarbon dating of the oldest legend rock images, conducted through analysis of the desert varnish overlying the carvings, has produced dates that some researchers consider potentially conservative, suggesting that the oldest marks here may be even older than the 5 to 10,000 year range most commonly cited. New dating technologies continue to refine and in some cases extend the chronological reach of sites like this one, consistently pushing the timeline of human presence and human ceremonial activity on the northern plains further back than earlier frameworks anticipated. Outside mainstream scholarship, the large anthropomorphic figures at Legend Rock have attracted interpretations that reach beyond the shamanic practitioner framework. Some researchers working in the tradition of alternative archaeology have pointed to certain formal qualities of the figures, their scale, their frontality, their apparent authority as evidence of a more complex cosmological system than the term shamanism can adequately capture. The suggestion has been made by a small number of investigators that the figures represent a formalized pantheon, a structured system of named, ranked spiritual beings whose depiction at sites like Legend Rock served a function analogous to the religious iconography of other ancient traditions worldwide. This interpretation is speculative in ways that the archaeological record cannot currently resolve, but it raises a genuine question about the categories we use, about whether the term shamanic, however carefully applied, is capacious enough to hold the full complexity of the belief systems that produce these images, or whether it sometimes functions as a container that flattens what it purports to describe. The cliff at Cottonwood Creek holds the heat of the Wyoming afternoon, long after the sun has moved past it. The sandstone is warm to the touch, the desert varnish smooth and dark against the lighter stone beneath. Wherever a carving has broken through it, the creek below is dry and summer, just a suggestion of water in the sandy channel, a memory of the resource that drew people here in wetter seasons across 10,000 years of returning. The figures on the wall look out from the stone with the particular quality of presence that front-facing images always carry, the quality that makes the viewer aware, suddenly and somewhat uncomfortably, of being seen as, well as seeing of standing in a relationship rather than simply conducting an observation. 300 images, 10,000 years, dozens of distinct hands working in styles separated by centuries, all choosing the same cliff face, all adding to something already underway when they arrived. What did they know about this place that we are still trying to learn? And what is it that keeps asserting itself across every change of season, every change of culture, every change of the world outside this small canyon, as worth returning to, worth marking, worth the labor of permanence? Legend Rock left us with the sensation of being seen, of standing before figures so deliberately composed, so formally frontal in their orientation, that the ordinary boundary between observer and observed begins to feel unstable. It is a sensation that recurs at these places in different forms and with different intensities, and it is worth sitting with rather than explaining away, because it may be telling us something about what these sites were designed to do. Not simply to record, not simply to commemorate, but to activate, to create a relationship between the image and the person standing before it that persists across the centuries, separating maker from viewer. That quality of activation of a site that does something to the person who enters it, that changes the terms of perception rather than simply providing information, is what we encounter now in a form so elegant and so precisely engineered that it stops being metaphorical and becomes literal, becomes in the most concrete sense a mechanism, a device for measuring the sky, built not from metal or glass or any material more sophisticated than stone and pigment, and the patient application of astronomical knowledge accumulated across generations of watching. We are going to Utah, to the western edge of the state, where the landscape transitions between the basin and range terrain of the Great Basin and the higher Colorado Plateau country to the east. Iron County, Utah, a high desert valley ringed by mountains that trap the cold in winter and release it reluctantly into a summer that arrives late and departs early. The valley floor sits at roughly 5,000 feet, and the mountains above it reach considerably higher. Their ridgelines, cutting clean geometric profiles against a sky that at this elevation and in this dry air achieves a clarity that makes astronomical observation almost involuntary. You look up here because the sky demands it, and cutting through one of those mountain ridgelines with a precision that the geology alone cannot entirely account for, there is a gap. Parowan Gap is a water gap, a notch cut through the red hills by an ancient river that no longer exists, drained away when the climate of the Great Basin shifted thousands of years ago, and the lake systems that once covered this valley evaporated into the dry air. What the vanished river left behind is a passage through the ridge approximately 1 mile long and several hundred feet wide, oriented on an axis that runs roughly northwest to southeast, an orientation that, as researchers have established with increasing precision over the past several decades, aligns with a remarkable number of significant astronomical events across the annual solar and lunar calendar. The walls of the gap are covered in petroglyphs, more than 90 panels containing hundreds of individual carved images distributed along the sandstone surfaces of the passage in a configuration that researchers have spent years attempting to fully document and interpret. The images include the full visual vocabulary familiar from other sites on this journey: human figures, animal forms, geometric patterns, abstract symbols. But at Parowan Gap, they exist within a context that gives them an additional dimension of meaning, because here, more clearly than at almost any other site in North America, the carvings and the landscape work together as a single integrated system. The Fremont people, a culture that flourished across Utah and neighboring regions from approximately 400 to 300 AD, are the most frequently cited makers of the Parowan Gap. Petroglyphs and the stylistic characteristics of many of the carvings are consistent with documented Fremont rock art traditions. The Fremont were agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers who maintained a sophisticated relationship with the landscape of the Colorado Plateau and Great Basin, and whose rock art tradition is characterized by the distinctive trapezoidal human figures, elaborate headdresses, and precisely geometric forms that appear throughout the region. But the full chronological range of the Parowan Gap carvings extends beyond the Fremont period, with some images suggesting earlier Archaic period occupation of the site, and others potentially more recent. The gap itself, as a natural landmark and as a passage through a mountain ridge, would have been a significant feature of the landscape for every culture that moved through this valley. Across thousands of years, it channels both travel and attention. You pass through it, and in passing through it, you are oriented literally by its geometry. The astronomical dimension of Parowan Gap has been the focus of sustained research by investigators, including Vern Swanson, whose work helped establish the site's ensever's function as what he and others have described as a solar and lunar calendar. The gap's orientation means that the sun, at various points in its annual cycle, rises and sets in realignment with specific features of the gap's topography. Features that, combined with specific petroglyphs on the walls, create a system for marking the solstices, equinoxes, and other significant points in the astronomical calendar, with a precision that researchers have documented through direct observation and measurement. On the winter solstice, sunlight entering the gap illuminates specific carved panels in ways that appear deliberately engineered. Light falling on particular symbols at the exact moment of astronomical significance, creating a visual event that functions as both calendar marker and ceremonial moment. Similar effects have been documented at other points in the annual cycle. The gap is not merely a place where petroglyphs happen to exist, near an astronomical alignment. It is a place where the petroglyphs and the astronomical alignment have been brought into deliberate relationship, where the carved marks on the walls serve as indices for the light that falls on them at specific moments in the year. This interpretation has achieved a reasonable degree of mainstream acceptance, situated within the broader understanding of Fremont and ancestral PBLO and astronomical knowledge that has developed significantly as researchers have applied careful measurement to sites across the Colorado Plateau region. The evidence at Parowan Gap for intentional astronomical encoding is considered by many investigators to be among the strongest available for any North American rock art site. What mainstream scholarship is more cautious about is the full extent of the system. The question of how many astronomical events are encoded in the gap's configuration, and whether the relationship between the carvings and the sky is even more complex and more precisely calibrated than current analysis has established. Some researchers have proposed that Parowan Gap functions as a comprehensive astronomical instrument, one capable of tracking not just the solar year, but the 18-year lunar standstill cycle that we encountered at Newark, and potentially other celestial cycles whose encoding in the landscape has not yet been fully worked out. Outside the mainstream, Parowan Gap has attracted the attention of investigators who see in its astronomical sophistication evidence of a more advanced scientific tradition than the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North American cultures typically accommodates. Some have drawn connections between Parowan Gap and other astronomically significant sites across the continent, arguing for a network of related knowledge, a shared astronomical tradition that expressed itself in locally specific forms across a vast geographic range. This hypothesis remains speculative and contested, but it draws on a genuine pattern, the recurrence at site after site across North America of the same quality of careful, sustained sky watching, encoded in the same medium of rock and landscape. The Put people, whose ancestral territory includes the Parowan Valley, maintain knowledge of this site within their own cultural framework. Knowledge that, as at so many of the places we have visited, exists in a relationship with the academic interpretation that is complementary rather than redundant, addressing dimensions of the site's significance that measurement and documentation alone cannot reach. The gap still works. The light still enters at the solstice and falls on the carved surfaces in the sequence that someone long ago designed it to fall. The geometry of the landscape and the geometry of the sky still meet here twice a year in the precise relationship that the people who built this instrument established and preserved. We can measure that relationship now with tools far more precise than anything available to the people who created it, and yet they got it right, which raises a question that the gap's clean geometry makes almost uncomfortably sharp. What else did they know about the sky, about the land, about the relationship between the two, that we are still in the process of learning how to ask about, let alone answer? Parowan Gap demonstrated something that this entire journey has been moving toward. The recognition that the people who made these marks were not simply expressing themselves in the way that word is sometimes used casually to suggest an impulse without a system behind it. They were doing something precise, something calibrated, something that required the kind of knowledge that only accumulates across generations of careful, sustained, disciplined attention to the world, to the sky, to the land, to the relationship between them, and to the human community situated within that relationship. That precision does not diminish as we move. It deepens, and it takes on new dimensions as we arrive at a site where the sheer scale of the reeve, accumulated record, forces a confrontation with something that individual sites, however significant, cannot fully convey on their own, because there are places where the density of the human mark becomes so overwhelming, so insistent in its volume and variety, that it stops being a collection of individual images and becomes something more like a city, a metropolis of human expression laid out across volcanic stone on the western edge of a desert valley, speaking in more voices simultaneously than any single framework can hold. We are in New Mexico now, on the western outskirts of Albuquerque, where the city's residential sprawl runs up against a 17-May escarpment of black basalt that rises from the Rio Grande Valley, floor like a wall, dark and angular, and geologically young by the standards of the surrounding landscape, formed by volcanic eruptions between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago that poured lava across the desert surface and left it to cool into the rough vicular rock that now forms the West Mesa's eastern edge. The basalt is dark because of its mineral composition, but it is darker still in many places because of desert varnish, the slow manganese-rich patina that accumulates on exposed rock surfaces in arid environments over thousands of years. And it is into that dark varnish against the lighter stone beneath that human hands have been carving images for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. This is Petroglyph National Monument, and the number of individual carvings it contains, spread across the escarpment 17 miles of volcanic rock, is estimated at approximately 25,000 petroglyphs on a single basalt escarpment at Tuxtla, the edge of a desert city. It is a number that when you stand at the base of the dark rock wall and begin to scan its surface, stops feeling like a statistic and starts feeling like a presence, like something that has accumulated enough mass to assert its own gravity. The site is managed as a partnership between the National Park Service and the PBLO of Isla and other PBLO nations whose ancestral and ongoing relationships with this landscape give the monument its deepest context. The petroglyphs are understood within the mainstream archaeological and cultural framework as the work primarily of the ancestors of the PBLO peoples. The same broad cultural tradition that produced the great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the massive communal architecture of Choco Canyon, and the continuous occupation of the Rio Grande Valley that persists in the living PBLO communities of New Mexico today. The images at Petroglyph National Monument reflect the full complexity of that tradition. Across the full span of its occupation of this landscape, animals appear in abundance: roadrunners, snakes, lizards, birds, mountain lions, bear paws, and the horned serpent that recurs across the iconographic vocabulary of Pueblo's ceremonial life as one of its most significant and most carefully depicted spiritual beings. Human figures appear in the postures and with the attributes that researchers have associated with ceremony, with hunting, with the marking of identity and affiliation. Geometric forms, spirals, crosses, stars, concentric circles, stepped cloud forms carry the visual vocabulary of a cosmological system that organized the PBLO world into a structure of relationships between sky and earth, between human and non-human, between the visible and the invisible. And then there are the masks, face-like forms, some realistic enough to suggest specific ceremonial regalia, others so stylized that the human reference is present only as an organizing principle behind an arrangement of marks that is primarily geometric. The masked figures at Petroglyph National Monument have attracted particular attention from researchers because they appear to connect directly to the Casina tradition, the system of masked spiritual beings that remains central to the ceremonial life of the Hopi, Zuri, and Rio Grande PBLO peoples today. If the masked figures at Petroglyph National Monument represent early Kakas, as some researchers have proposed, then the carved basalt escarpment outside Albuquerque holds visual evidence for the deep historical roots of a ceremonial tradition that is still actively practiced by living communities. This connection between the ancient carved surface and the living tradition is at Petroglyph National Monument more than most sites a matter of immediate practical significance. The PBLO peoples, whose ancestors made these images, maintain relationships with specific petroglyphs that are ceremonial rather than historical. Relationships in which certain images are not simply records of past practice, but active participants in ongoing spiritual life. This is why the monument's management structure gives PBLO communities a formal role in decisions about the site, and why certain petroglyphs in certain areas of the escarpment are treated with a degree of restricted access that reflects their continued sacred status. Mainstream interpretation of the Petroglyph National Monument corpus is well developed, grounded in decades of documentation and in the extraordinary resource of continuous cultural knowledge maintained by the PBLO nations themselves. But the sheer volume and chronological range of the carvings means that the mainstream framework, however robust, addresses only a portion of what 25,000 images across 3,000 years of carving contains. Some of the images at Petroglyph National Monument do not fit neatly into the PBLO ancestral framework. A smaller number of carvings, their precise quantity and location, a matter of ongoing documentation, have been identified by some researchers as potentially predating the PBLO tradition, belonging to earlier archaic period occupation of the Rio Grande Valley, whose cultural connections to the later PBLO tradition are not straightforward. These older images, if correctly identified, would extend the chronological reach of the escarpment's record and complicate the question of who was here and doing what before the cultural tradition most visible in the monuments. Imagery had fully formed. Outside the mainstream, Petroglyph National Monument has attracted the attention of researchers who see in certain images evidence of contact, influence, or parallel development connecting the Rio Grande Valley to traditions far beyond the American Southwest. Some investigators have identified what they interpret as symbols with analogies in Mesoamerican iconographic systems, connections that, if genuine, would imply a more direct and more sustained exchange of ideas between the cultures of the Rio Grande and those of central Mexico than the mainstream archaeological consensus has typically acknowledged. This remains a contested area of interpretation, with serious researchers on both sides of the question. Others have focused on the astronomical dimension of specific petroglyph panels, on the way that certain images are activated by solstice or equinox light in ways that parallel what we observed at Parowan Gap and at other sites across this journey. The basalt escarpment's eastern-facing orientation means that morning light strikes the rock surface at angles that change precisely and predictably across the solar year, creating conditions in which specific panels could function as seasonal markers for a community living in the valley below. Documentation of specific light interactions at Petroglyph National Monument is less advanced than at some other sites, in part because the monument's scabbard's management appropriately prioritizes protection over unrestricted research access. But the potential is there, embedded in the geometry of the escarpment and the sky, waiting for the right collaboration between researchers and PBLO knowledge holders to bring it into focus. 25,000 voices carved into black stone at the edge of a desert city, most of them made by the ancestors of people who are still here, whose descendants live in the PBLO communities of New Mexico, maintaining the traditions and the knowledge that these images were made to hold. The escarpment is still dark in the morning before the sun clears the Sandia Mountains to the east, and then the light arrives and the varnished surface catches it, and the carved marks stand out in the low-angle illumination with a clarity that the flat light of midday obscures. For a few minutes each morning, the escarpment speaks. The question is not whether we can hear it. The question is whether we have done the work, the slow, humble, collaborative work to be ready to understand what it is actually saying. Petroglyph National Monument brought us to the edge of something vast. 25,000 voices carved into volcanic stone, speaking across 3,000 years in a language that the living descendants of its makers have never stopped understanding, even as the rest of the world forgot how to listen. It asked us to consider what readiness looks like, what the slow, humble, collaborative work of genuine understanding actually requires from those who approach these places from outside the traditions that created them. Now we step back even further, further than the oldest petroglyph, further than the oldest sandal, further than the deepest stratigraphic layer of any cave or rock shelter we have visited on this journey. We are going to a mystery that does not involve human hands at all, or that may involve them, depending on which interpretation you find most persuasive. And that raises questions not about what people believed, or built, or recorded, but about the world those people inherited, the world they woke up into, in a North America that was at a specific and catastrophic moment in question. Deep prehistory, fundamentally and permanently changed. Fly over the Atlantic coastal plain of the southeastern United States, over the Carolinas, over Georgia, over parts of Virginia, Maryland, and Florida, and look down. What you see distributed across the flat coastal landscape, in numbers that are difficult to comprehend from the ground, are ellipses, oval depressions in the earth, each one oriented in roughly the same direction, northwest to southeast, each one with a slightly raised sandy rim along its southeastern edge, each one ranging in size from a few acres to several miles in length. From the air, they are unmistakable. From the ground, most of them are invisible, filled with water, grown over with vegetation, absorbed into the agricultural patchwork of the coastal plain in ways that make them indistinguishable from ordinary wetlands, unless you know exactly what you are looking for. These are the Carolina bays, and there are at least 500,000 of them, 500,000 elliptical depressions, all oriented in the same direction, all with the same raised southeastern rim, distributed across a coastal plain stretching from New Jersey to Florida, in a pattern that viewed from altitude looks less like a geological formation and more like the aftermath of something, like a surface that received something all at once from a specific direction with a force that left its signature in the land and then departed, leaving only the shapes behind. Behind the name comes from the bay trees, Lovely Bay, Red Bay, Sweet Bay, that grow in the wet depressions and give the landscape of the Carolina coastal plain its particular aromatic character. The bays themselves, as ecological features, are recognized as among the most biodiverse wetland habitats in North America, refugia for plant and animal species that have survived in these shallow, isolated basins across thousands of years of surrounding landscape change. Their ecological significance is documented and studied, and in that sense, well understood. Their origin is not. The mainstream geological explanation for the Carolina bays has shifted considerably over the decades since they were first described from the air in the 1930s, when early aerial photography made the pattern visible for the first time at the scale necessary to grasp it. Early researchers were immediately struck by the consistency of orientation and shape, by the fact that 500,000 depressions, all pointing the same direction, all with the same raised rim on the same side, seemed to demand a single formative event rather than the kind of gradual, locally variable process that typically produces geological features. The impact hypothesis, the idea that the Carolina bays were formed by a cosmic impact event, either a meteor strike or the airburst of a fragmenting comet, was proposed early and has been periodically revived and revised. The orientation of the bays, if extended backward along their northwest-southeast axis, converges roughly on the Great Lakes region, suggesting to proponents of the impact theory that a projectile or swarm of projectiles originating from that direction struck the coastal plain at a low angle, leaving the elliptical imprint pattern visible today. The current mainstream geological consensus is more cautious, attributing the bays primarily to wind and water processes, to the action of prevailing winds on shallow water bodies during the cold, dry conditions of the last glacial maximum, creating the oriented ellipses through a combination of wave action and sediment transport. This explanation accounts for the orientation and the raised rims without requiring a catastrophic event, but it has not fully satisfied all researchers. The sheer number of the features, their remarkable consistency across such a vast geographic range, and the precision of their shared orientation have continued to draw investigators who find the wind and water explanation insufficient, too slow, too variable, too dependent on processes that should produce more randomness than the Carolina Bays actually display. The debate sharpened significantly in the early 21st century when a multidisciplinary research team published evidence for what they called the Younger Deuce Impact Hypothesis, the proposal that approximately 12,800 years ago, at the onset of the younger, driest cold period, a fragmenting comet struck or airburst over the North American ice sheet, triggering catastrophic fires, massive floods from melting glacial ice, and an ecological collapse that contributed to the extinction of the North American megafauna, the mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and other large animals that disappeared from the continent at roughly this time. The Carolina Bays in this framework are the surface expression of that event, the imprint of the ejective field from a cosmic impact that reshaped the North American continent in a matter of hours and set in motion environmental changes that played out over centuries. The Younger Deuce Impact Hypothesis remains contested. It has attracted serious scientific support and serious scientific criticism in roughly equal measure, with the debate centering on the interpretation of specific geochemical markers, nanodiamonds, spherules, iridium anomalies that proponents identify at the younger driest boundary layer in sediment cores across the continent, and that critics argue can be explained by other processes. What makes this debate directly relevant to the story of Native American history and mystery is the timing. 12,800 years ago is precisely the period of the earliest confirmed human occupation of North America. The people who left sandals in Fort Rock Cave, who made the oldest marks at Coso and at Jeffers and at Pictoraph Cave, their ancestors were here when, if the impact hypothesis is correct, something fell from the sky with sufficient force to leave 500,000 elliptical scars across the southeastern coastal plain and trigger an ecological catastrophe of continental scale. The oral traditions of numerous Native American nations include accounts of a great catastrophe, of fire from the sky, of floods, of a period of darkness and cold, of the world being remade after a destruction that only some survived. These traditions have generally been treated by Western scholarship as myth, as metaphorical, narratives about the human condition, rather than as historical records of specific events. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, if it continues to gather scientific support, would require a reconsideration of that dismissal, would suggest that what was preserved in oral tradition across hundreds of generations may be in its essential structure a memory of something real. The Carolina Bays are still there, 500,000 of them, growing their bay trees and sheltering their rare species, and sitting in the coastal plain landscape in a pattern that has waited since the last ice age for someone to agree on what made them from the ground. You cannot see them. You have to rise above them before the pattern becomes visible, before the individual features resolve into the larger shape that tells you something happened here all at once, from a specific direction. How much of what we know about the deep past of this continent was shaped by an event we are only now beginning to recognize, and how much of what survived that event in the land and in the memory of the people who were here are we still learning to? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming journeys. See you in the next video.